Welcome, everyone, to the 92nd Street Y New York's 7th State of America Summit. I'm Seth Pinsky, CEO here at 92NY, and we're gathering at a moment that couldn't feel more consequential. We are deep in the 2024 election cycle, with crucial races happening at every level of government. In just a few weeks, Americans will cast ballots that will help determine the future of democracy itself. These elections aren't just about candidates. They're about the issues that define the direction of this country: reproductive rights, immigration policy, the future of the Supreme Court. These issues are on the ballot, and so is the future of our democratic system. For a century and a half, 92NY has stood at the intersection of culture, civic life, and ideas, bringing people together, whether here in New York or from around the globe through our digital platforms. As we celebrate this legacy, we're reminded that our mission, to foster critical conversations about who we are and where we're going, has never been more urgent. That's why the State of America Summit matters so much. This gathering is more than an event. It's a reminder of the work we do as a cultural institution, as a space for dialogue, and as a trusted platform for some of the most significant discussions of our time. And today, we're lucky to have an extraordinary lineup of thinkers, advocates, and leaders, people who are shaping the policies and debates that will define our future. Together, we'll explore what's truly at stake in this election. Before we dive into today's conversations, I'd like to take a moment to express deep appreciation to Craig Newmark Philanthropies, the generous support of which made today's summit possible, as well as the broader Newmark Civic Life series. Craig's vision for a civically engaged, informed, and healthy democracy is closely aligned with the work that we do here at 92NY. And now, let's get started. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a compelling and vital program.
Hey, I'm Craig Newmark. I'm the lead sponsor of the Newmark Civic Life series at the 92nd Street Y, New York. The election we're approaching is a really big deal, and we need to recognize that all of us have a bit of influence in shaping the direction of the entire country. The fabric of our democracy, of our country, is fraying, and it's everyone's role to restore the principles of decency, dignity, and trust. I really feel civic engagement isn't just a responsibility, it is mission critical for a thriving democracy and for a thriving America. That's why it's a really big deal for me to continue our collaboration between Craig Newmark Philanthropies and the 92nd Street Y. We're working together, trying to deliver reliable, transparent, and pro-democracy, pro-American content. It needs to be accurate, it needs to be nonpartisan, which is really mission critical, vital for a healthy democracy and a healthy country. The 92nd Street Y is one of the best platforms for this that I can think about, and the State of America Summit is a critical part of that. Today's program delves into what's at stake in the upcoming elections, from the future of the Supreme Court to immigration policy to voting rights. By being here, you're standing up for the strengthening of our democracy, of our country, and I'm proud to support the State of America Summit in this mission to inform and to share serious power with you, the next generation of the defenders of democracy and our country. Thanks for being here. I'm hoping that you'll find today's program is enlightening and seriously empowering.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Barone-Lopez. I am the White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, and today I'm joined by Bill Kristol, who is the editor-at-large of The Bulwark, as well as Tara Setmayer, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Seneca Project, as well as a resident scholar at UVA Center for Politics. So I'm glad that both of you are here to have this conversation, which is about the future of the executive branch, the future of the presidency, and what what the presidency will look like depending on who wins, whether or not it's Vice President Kamala Harris or former President Donald Trump. So let's jump right in. Both of you have spent decades in Republican politics. Bill, I'll go to you first, and then Tara, you next. But Bill, one of the things that Donald Trump is proposing is mass deportations. And that's something that has been in the news a lot recently because of the fact that he is saying that he'll start in Springfield, Ohio, with Haitian immigrants, legal immigrants. What kind of expansion of the executive powers would this require to carry out mass deportations like that?
I mean, it's a kind of unbelievable prospect in terms of just the mechanics of it and the resources that would have to be spent doing it, leaving aside the fact that it would be a deplorable thing to do. But the president does have a lot of power in immigration, as we see, and the courts can step in, but the courts aren't, might be more sympathetic to some of the things that President Trump will try to do next time, as opposed to 2017. So I think it's a good case where a lot of savvy Washington types say, oh, come on, he can't do this, he can't do that. And that's true in some areas where Congress really does have a fundamental role. But there are a heck of a lot of areas where the law is murky, it's gray, different courts can interpret things differently. A lot can be done before a court might reverse something even. And I think immigration is one of those areas. So people should take seriously when Trump and Vance say 10 million deportations, when they say, as you pointed out, Laura, that they're going to deport Haitians who are here legally on temporary protected status. They're not going to go to Congress to change that law, apparently. They're not going to, do a kind of normal administrative procedure where there's notice and comment and people can weigh in and you get hearings and so forth. They're just going to act, they've said this, they're going to act abruptly on a host of fronts of immigration, in immigration policy, to use unilateral executive power to make pretty radical changes.
Tara, what do you make of this? And like Bill said, the dismissal from some Republicans who say that there are checks and balances and he can't really carry something like this out.
Well, I'm in the same boat as Bill here with this, in that he actually can do quite a lot when it comes to the executive branch. And Donald Trump is surrounded by people who have been studying this for decades, as we can see in their agenda, whether it's Project 2025 or Schedule F or Agenda 47, whatever iteration you want to look at. But these are people who feel that the unitary executive branch theory, which was big in the Reagan administration, is something that it's a fever dream that they are looking to deploy if they're back in power again. And Donald Trump would be the vehicle to do that. And when you control, as the chief executive officer really of the country, right, the president's responsible for the executive branch, when you're responsible for the 15 cabinet departments and the dozens of federal agencies and boards and all of these things, they are looking for ways where there are loopholes and where this has never really been challenged at the way that Donald Trump would challenge those guardrails. We've seen already in the past how Donald Trump has reacted to those guardrails and how willing he is to blast right through them. And in the last Trump administration, we saw that there were people there who respected those guardrails and respected precedent and established norms and institutions. But this time around, those people aren't here. And that's not who Donald Trump will be surrounded with. So when he says that this is what he would like to do, people need to believe him. It's a nice cover for some of these Republicans to, maybe they're trying to give comfort to themselves or why they're supporting someone who openly brags about blasting through these guardrails, that they think, oh, no. But I think you have to be careful. There's a certain lack of imagination that could be dangerous here. And if anyone thinks that it's not possible, I don't think a lot of people thought January 6th would be possible either. So I would caution them, thinking that the traditional guardrails of Congress and what we've respected in the past would stop Donald Trump from trying to implement some of the more imperialistic president, autocratic things that he's looking to do.
You mentioned the unitary executive theory, which is something that the people that wrote Project 2025, members of the Heritage Foundation, as well as the other conservative groups that wrote that, many of them worked in the first Trump administration. But the unitary executive theory is this idea, right, that the president ultimately has the control. that he has more power than I think the average American necessarily thinks that he would. That's the theory, anyways, that the president should. Bill, you worked in two administrations, the Ronald Reagan administration, the George H.W. Bush administration. Was this theory floating around when you were working in those administrations? Why do you think it's become so prominent within MAGA Republican politics?
But I think it was actually a respectable theory. It wasn't just a theory. It's a description of actually how the U.S. government works in many ways. That always has worked. I mean, then there were all these independent agencies that were set up in the New Deal, and there were legitimate debates. I mean, how independent should these agencies be? You don't want to have sort of people making policy contrary to the president, presumably, who just are doing so with no check, with no ability. If it's a policy area, this is not a matter of judicial actions, but energy policy or something. So these were debates at the margin. I mean, I was in the Reagan administration at the Education Department. I was in the White House under President Bush, and we tried to rein in these agencies a little bit and adjust some of the way the regulatory process worked, for example. But this was like changing from, I don't know what's the football, from one 45-yard line to another 45-yard line. And I think some of those changes certainly were in a reasonable area. And the Clinton administration and even in the Obama administration kept on with some of these changes to kind of make sure government policies were more coherent and so forth. This is totally different from what the Heritage Foundation and what Donald Trump want to do. They want the president to have personal control over hiring and firing civil servants, personal control over what happens in the Defense Department, personal ability to call up the Justice Department and say, prosecute this person and don't prosecute that. I mean, none of that was stuff that we tried to do or really conceived of doing in the Reagan or Bush administrations. And we left in place the post-Watergate checks on intervening in criminal cases in the Justice Department or intervening in other cases. We got met. I remember very well the briefing when I went to work in the White House. You cannot call the Justice Department if someone, even if it looks legit, even if it's a genuine question you have about, someone gets in touch with you and says, this antitrust action seems like they misunderstand the industry. There are ways you can get that. You can help forward a complaint or a suggestion document to people at Justice, just as if they wrote Justice directly. Obviously, you can give them the right email address, but you can't put pressure on parts of the Justice Department in these areas. Now, if you're going to change antitrust law, you can go to Congress. There could be regulations where there'll be comments. So this is just one tiny example of there's a way to move policy, and there's a way to try to obviously control agencies to some degree, but that's very different. But that's all in the interests of a policy agenda, which incidentally has congressional checks, judicial checks, administrative law checks. There's a whole Administrative Procedure Act that tells you what you can and can't do, which then creates a record for courts to look at. They don't want any of that. They want no record, no procedures, no sort of due process with the administrative branch. They want Trump to be able to pick up the phone and say, I want this guy to be a general here. I want troops deployed on our streets there, because I'm going to invoke the Insurrection Act. I want this criminal case. I want a criminal investigation of, PBS tomorrow because I don't like what they've been doing. And I also don't like some of the nonprofits in New York. So I want to take a look at their IRS returns. That's what he wants. That's totally different from the more respectable version of unitary executive theory.
Tara, what do you think about the more respectable version, which is, the role of the president in, like Bill said, reining in the agencies here and there at the margins? How much do you think either of these candidates, when you're comparing Vice President Harris to Donald Trump, what do you see her relationship with agencies potentially being versus his?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who comes from the Reagan-esque form of conservatism, that's really what shaped my entree into Republican politics. Bill is correct about that. The way that administration approached it, and there was always a concern about the federal bureaucracy to a certain degree engaging in more activist policies that weren't in line with what the administration wanted. So how do you balance that out? It was always pretty much a policy debate here, which I think most people would argue is a legitimate one. And one that is part of the push and pull of politics and of the way our system works. It's very uniquely set up that way with the three branches of government and the way our founding fathers intended. However, Bill is correct that the new interpretation, this current Trumpian interpretation of what that unitary executive theory is something we should all be very concerned about. It is no longer in the margins. This is what they want to do. And there are a myriad of articles dozens upon dozens going back a few years where Trump and his allies are telegraphing what they plan to do and why. Bill brought up the Insurrection Act. Donald Trump has said that he would invoke the Insurrection Act on day one after he's inaugurated. If there was any type of civil unrest or protest or things like that, he would unleash the powers of the federal government on peaceful protesters in this country. We saw him do that back in the summer of 2020 in a very upsetting and concerning way, particularly like Lafayette Square. This is something that again goes back to the lack of imagination. The Insurrection Act hasn't been invoked in, I don't know how long. When was the last time? It's been quite some time, not this century or last. That should concern people. The idea that he would weaponize the Department of Justice. We've seen Donald Trump, and this is not just Bill and I pontificating on this. Donald Trump has told us, he has put it on his Truth Social network. He has said this in rallies, that he would weaponize the Department of Justice against his political enemies. He has threatened Joe Biden and his family. He has threatened the press. The press will be some of the first. He wants to jail media executives and journalists. So the mass deportation part, which was the beginning of our conversation, is just one aspect of some of the ways that Donald Trump would weaponize the federal bureaucracy. Now, would Kamala Harris do these things? I don't think so. She has never said she would. It seems as though we wouldn't have to worry about an attack on democratic norms and institutions with a Kamala Harris administration, because everything that she has said so far, everything in her record as a career public servant, Bill and I may not agree on some policy issues, but there is no question that she would respect the democratic norms and institutions that have been constitutionally put in place or put in place by Congress or the courts that wouldn't fundamentally reshape the way our federal bureaucracy works or what the role of the presidency is. I have no doubt that her and Tim Walz and whoever she surrounded herself in her administration with would be respectful of those norms.
One of the other things that Trump has proposed, which you both have touched on, is installing loyalists across the federal agencies. So, essentially, and making more of the civil servants actually making them more political appointees across the board. Bill, what kind of impact? Look, every president wants to have people across the agencies that will work with them and do the kind of implement the kind of policy that they want to see implemented during their administration. But why is what Trump is proposing so different than, just the regular process of having political appointees during any given administration?
Well, as you say, there are political appointees. I was one, and there are many others at the education department. I think in those days, it's a much smaller department, maybe 125 of them, over a bureaucracy of a few thousand. But the bureaucracy was responsive to them. And if they weren't, you could do things to get better career appointees in who were more capable of achieving the goals you were looking to get to do. There was a process for swapping out different appointees, sending them to different jobs and so forth. People could apply to be career appointees in the federal government. Obviously, we all know people who probably are career appointees in many, many different parts of the federal government, ranging from the Defense Department to the Social Security Agency to other Veterans Affairs and so forth. But there are political appointees over them, and it's actually worked out pretty well. There's a pretty good balance of political direction and career people who are experts, who know what the rules and laws are, who will say, wait a second, I understand that you want to do this, but here's what the current laws on the book are and the current judicial interpretations of those laws. And we have to go through this process if you want to change this. You either go to Congress or have a notice and hearing under the Administrative Procedure Act. The system works okay right now, actually. It's pretty responsive, I think, appropriately responsive. And what the Trump people want to do is be able to fire a non-political. They want to increase the number of political appointees, fire the civil servants they don't like, who are not sufficiently pliant, I suppose, to them, or for other reasons, incidentally. They don't want to have, if they don't like, honestly, their skin color, they can fire them on those grounds too, right? How do we ever know, So all these protections that are in there, maybe they're a little, again, there are reasons to be for civil service reform. Maybe there should be 5,000 political appointees, not 4,000. Maybe the process that the Merit Protection System Board works under is a little too cumbersome. Those are all reasonable things to debate. Bill Clinton and Al Gore, a lot of what they did with that reinventing government, remember that, was an attempt to streamline some of these things. That's a totally different agenda and debate from what Trump wants to do. He wants it to be his executive branch, not the president's executive branch, not the president governing according to law and according to court decisions and according to congressional limitations. He wants it to be his, really unsupervised, unchecked. It's very, very dangerous and really is not a way a liberal democracy or a government that's dedicated to the rule of law should work.
Tara, why should voters care that someone like Donald Trump may be able to make the executive branch, all these federal agencies, entirely beholden to him without some of the checks and balances that both you and Bill have talked about traditionally exist? I mean, just distilling it a bit more for people in terms of how it could even impact their everyday lives.
Yeah, absolutely. People should really care, because sometimes what we think about the role of the presidency to be, the president doesn't actually have much impact on. What happens in Congress, yes, the president can set an agenda, or there are certain domestic policy initiatives that the president wants, but their hands are tied depending on what happens in Congress. Congress passes the laws. It's the president's job to faithfully execute them. So, foreign policy is really where the president has the most direct impact on policy and unilateral and kind of decision making on many things, but there's even checks and balances there. People should really care about what happens in these federal agencies and how the president uses them to his own benefit, because our lives are impacted every day, whether we realize it or not, by a lot of these bureaucratic agencies. They're the ones who set the rules and the policies and the regulations on what governs our lives every day. And Donald Trump has been so irresponsible with the historical precedent, with the judicial interpretations, with the basic foundations and principles of what our constitutional checks and balances are, that the fact that he would disregard them, I think Donald Trump's own behavior, just all you have to do is watch one rally or listen to one interview or just read his social media feed, should show you that this is not someone who should be entrusted with those powers. There's a reason why. Actually, in the beginning, the president used to have the ability to hire and fire everybody in the federal government. But in 1883, it was the Pendleton Civil Service Act that changed that, because they were concerned about the spoils system, the rewarding of presidential allies versus having people there who may push back, who are career civil servants that don't have the same political loyalties, but are dedicated to the policy or the agency to get things done, in their opinion, a certain continuity of that wasn't influenced by politics. So since 1883, they recognized by then, yeah, we probably need to have something where there's a combination. You have the continuity of these folks who are career, and then you have the political appointees like Bill was talking to, that can come in and help push the president's overall agenda. Getting rid of that and having someone like Donald Trump, who has clearly said that retribution, I am your retribution, someone who thinks about that, who approaches governing that way, should concern every American. That is not our system. That's the system of dictatorship. That's the system of a kingship. That's a system that we fought a revolutionary war to get away from. That's a system that democratic countries across the world have fought very hard to maintain, that they don't have to, deal with that kind of authoritarianism. It doesn't work. It's oppressive to individuals. So, if you don't want someone like a Dr. Fauci, who has decades of experience in their position at the NIH, leading with their expertise in that position, you want Donald Trump to come in and just fire him because he wasn't in agreement with his policy, then I guess Donald Trump's your guy. But if you want people who have expertise and who are dedicated as career civil servants, public servants for the greater good, then Donald Trump is not your guy. And he's also commander in chief. This applies to Department of Defense. This is a guy who says, my generals, they're not his generals. They serve the people of the United States. But Donald Trump thinks it's its own, our country's his own personal fiefdom, and that should concern everyone.
Just to clarify, Fauci actually, I think, serves at the pleasure of the president. Did serve. He's at such a senior position, as Tara knows. But what Trump wants to do is fire the the person down in NIH or in the CDC who's doing studies and discovers that this drug isn't effective for this, and says, here's my report, my scientific report, and we have a way to review this in this agency with peer review and so forth. I don't want any of that. I want a study put out showing this drug is effective. Why? Because he either has ideological commitment to some kooky drugs being effective, or because he has relative friends and acquaintances who are invested in a certain thing. I mean, the degree of corruption you get once you start, we have set up, again, maybe it's almost a little too much to guard against the corruption, to guard against the spoil system. It's one thing to have a spoil system when you have a very small federal government. We have a pretty massive federal government. And do we want Trump to just be able to intervene everywhere and say, I want Medicare to buy this drug here because this guy is a contributor of mine? I want to change the normal bidding process for drilling on public lands. Let's take something that's a conservative priority, which I'm not against, incidentally, for oil and gas. Let's not have a competitive bidding process with open bidding and with career civil servants reviewing the bids and making sure that the companies are doing what they're saying they're doing. I just want that company to win that award. That's the kinds of things Trump would do. And then that's sort of the corruption side of it. But on the civil liberties side, the ability for abuse is so great. And we take for granted. When Trump was president, I turned 65. So I applied for Social Security and for Medicare. And you take it for granted that, of course, there's a non-career person there who's helping you navigate the system and giving you advice about where you should sign up for, and doesn't sort of, there's no political issue. Would you join the military? Our son served in the military. One assumes they're not going to get a political quiz. They're not going to be promoted from lieutenant to captain because of their ideological, their personal politics and so forth. We just take for granted an awful lot of good guardrails that we have, but they're not. They're not, some of them are in law, some of them are in norms and custom and memoranda and executive orders. And a lot of that can either be just overturned, overcome, or certainly evaded and run around. Trump did a fair amount of that in his first term with the Trump properties and the money that went there and so forth. But it was, I would say it was limited by the fact that most of the guardrails, as Tara put it, still held. But in the second term, they've given a lot of thought to how to make these guardrails crumble, and I'm afraid a fair number of them would.
Right. You mentioned the CDC. I mean, Project 2025 has proposed breaking up the CDC. They've also proposed abolishing departments like the Department of Education. And again, Project 2025 was written by dozens of former Trump administration's officials, people that are expected to staff a potential second Trump term. Now, I know that both of you are pretty clear about the fact that you think a second Trump administration would degrade democracy and the norms of the presidency and the institution itself. But I do want to ask you about President Biden and Vice President Harris. Have either of you seen any fundamental expansion of the executive under President Biden? Tara, you want to go first?
Yeah. Before I answer that, I just want to give 3 quick examples to what Bill just said. In the Trump administration, you had Ryan Zinke and some questionable contracts and things going on in his position. You had the ivermectin example of why Donald Trump was pushing this wacky theory about ivermectin as a COVID potential cure or treatment that was financially motivated in a lot of ways. And then as far as promotions, the Vindmans, Colonel Eugene Vindman and his brother, were denied their promotions, and their military careers were ended because of Donald Trump's retribution against them for speaking out about Ukraine. So those are just 3 small examples of dozens upon dozens of the type of corruption and retribution that Donald Trump inflicted the first time around that I think is often underreported, given the fire hose of problems and concerns that have happened not only in the Trump administration on all 3 of those fronts, but what's going on now as well. Now, as far as for the Biden presidency, look, there probably are some. And as someone who is more of a small government conservative, and I don't like the expansion of the president's powers that we've seen over the years in both Republican and Democratic sides. I mean, the Bush administration did it too, where it's advantageous to them. But I think for me, the concern really more is about the hypocrisy of it. If you're going to have a problem with the Biden administration doing this, whether it's on gun control or it's on, the FTC, there's some things that the Biden administration has done a little bit more unilaterally than we would probably prefer, very in the weeds. Then you need to be consistent about what Donald Trump did. If you're going to be upset about what President Obama did with the Consumer Protection Board, let's say, or the Labor Relations Board, then you need to be consistent about that ideologically, be intellectually honest about what Donald Trump is proposing, which is much exponentially much bigger and more invasive and more problematic, if that's what you claim. So I just think there needs to be intellectual honesty on that, and we can have those debates about whether it's a good thing or not, but let's be at least intellectually consistent and honest about it, which the Republican Party has not done.
I mean,
Bill, how about you on? Yeah, go ahead.
So two examples. President Biden expanded student loan forgiveness. That's a murky, I worked in the education department, so I know a little bit about this. I mean, it's a murky area about how much discretion a president has to forgive some loans, some categories of loans. He didn't forgive loans for his friends or favored banks or, or anything. He tried to, he thought there was better public policy to forgive them. It was controversial. People complained. They went to court. They won some, but lost, I think, a little more in court, and they obeyed the court order. The court. I mean, so certain loans that they had wished to forgive aren't being forgiven. Others, the court said was okay for them to forgive. So are there maybe they should have pushed a little harder than they should have, but it's a public policy dispute and a interpretation of kind of gray areas of the law dispute, which the Biden administration, like every administration before it, has pushed in a couple of areas, but certainly has also yielded when the court said no, or if Congress chose to say, no, that's not the law. Here's what we want in the case of the law. So they yielded to the courts. Trump, I don't believe, would necessarily in every area. But take a more obvious case, the Justice Department, who just pled guilty to tax charges, which honestly struck me as being a little bit of a reach, but whatever. The Justice Department investigated this person in a nonpartisan way. The president kept his hands off the case. The Attorney General kept his hands off the case. And Hunter Biden has now been found guilty in one set of charges and pled guilty to another. I mean, to say you can't even imagine something comparable happening in the next Trump Justice Department. You can't imagine a special counsel. What happened in the first term? Why, Jeff Sessions was old-fashioned enough. He's very, very conservative attorney general who believed in the unitary executive, actually, as a matter of legal theory. But he was an old-fashioned attorney general who thought, I've got to recuse myself from this case. And Rosenstein appointed Mueller and so forth. I mean, none of that's going to happen. None of that. Bill Barr, who pushed things further than I would have liked, he refused to do things at the end. But the key to Trump's second term is that all the barriers, all the people who Jim Mattis, Trump said, I want transgender people fired tomorrow from the military. And Jim Mattis said, well, we have regulations for how you can separate people. You'd have to change the regulation and then tell them that they have X amount of time to stay or not stay, whatever it would be. I don't even know. But there's a pretty big set of rules that govern people being separated from the military and not being fired unjustly. And Mattis insisted on that, and Trump and the White House relented. There'll be nothing like that in a Trump second term. So the degree to which you can have arbitrary decisions, favoritism, especially with justice, especially with defense, but really throughout the federal government deals with a ton of things, right? And a ton of businesses, a ton of individuals, all of us really. I think we take for granted an awful lot that we couldn't, I'm afraid, in a Trump second term.
And don't forget, you also have the judiciary, which has now given, based on recent rulings, whether it was the immunity ruling or the Chevron case, we cannot rely on the Supreme Court to necessarily institute those checks and balances that we thought before. And that should be concerning to people as well, because we used to feel some comfort that you would have a Supreme Court that wasn't so politically tainted, let's say, as the current one that we have now. And based on their recent rulings, that should also be an area of concern, knowing that the president has the ability to appoint Supreme Court justices and federal judges on the bench for life.
We don't have much time left, but I did want to ask about exactly that, Tara, which was specifically the immunity ruling. So the Supreme Court ruling that a president is immune for certain official acts that they carry out while they're in the presidency. What kind of impact do both of you, in about the few minutes we have left, think that will have going forward? Bill, you want to go first?
I think it's a bad decision. I mean, Richard Nixon was prosecuted. I mean, he was not prosecuted. General Ford pardoned him. But one way to see how radical the decision is that why did General Ford have to pardon Richard Nixon, which was very controversial and famous thing that he did? Well, because otherwise Nixon would have been prosecuted for these acts, right? Which were acts he ordered as president. They were, quote, official acts. He ordered the FBI and the CIA to do certain things. It wasn't, off on the side kind of thing, but it was wrong. And not having any legal accountability for the president himself, it implies what kind of legal accountability do you have for subordinates? What if they say, look, the president told me to do this? How am I supposed to say no? I'm not myself a lawyer or a court, am I going to say no and get fired? And so I think the degree to which that opens the door to an abuse. And here I just mentioned one other thing. Trump used the pardon power much more aggressively than really any of his predecessors in modern times. In the first term, pardoning people who were in the middle of investigations, clearly, I would say, buying their silence by pardoning them, and then pardoning people at the end for all kinds of reasons. A lot of presidents have done sort of dubious pardons at the end for people they kind of thought were unjustly prosecuted, people they were friendly to, but it was a few people. It was unseemly at times. Trump has said, I'm going to use the pardon power all the time. He's going to pardon the January 6th insurgents. So put together a government where the president's kind of immune. He's willing to use the pardon power. He's asking people to do things that are legally dubious, but hey, they'll be fired if they don't do them, and they'll be pardoned if they do them, and some court later on decides there was something wrong. You have people on the outside, kind of militias almost, whom he's also sort of basically promised to pardon. So they sort of rally to help Trump against his enemies. I think the degree to which you get a scenario that looks very far from anything we recognize as the rule of law is very worrisome.
Absolutely. We either believe that we are a country of the rule of law or we don't. We either believe that we're a country that is supposed to be about we the people and the equal application of that law and equal application of those things, or we don't. There really is at this point no room for lukewarm lukewarm interpretations of those things, because we've gotten a taste of what Donald Trump would do with those powers and the way it's being manipulated, and the way the rhetoric around what he plans to do is being manipulated to divide us in ways that we really have not seen since the Civil War. And to have someone that has the powers of the presidency with the ability to do that should be an area of grave concern for any American who respects our democratic norms and institutions, who respects the Constitution, and who believes that this country is a country that is supposed to be for all people, and a country where we're supposed to be able to pursue that pursuit of happiness should be something that's available to everyone, regardless of where you come from, your skin color, your religion. And Donald Trump has disrespected every aspect of what makes this country great, despite his political phrase. So I think as we wrap the conversation, that we should really pay attention and make a decision as a country to what type of country we want to live in. Do you feel comfortable handing the keys to our wonderful democracy and representative government to someone like Donald Trump, who we've already seen what he's capable of doing in the past? Because a Donald Trump future presidency is not about a government that's of, for, and by the people. It's about a government that is of, for, and by Donald Trump. And I think that a lot of Americans are not okay with that, nor should they be.
Well, we have to leave it there, but that was a really insightful and interesting conversation. So I really appreciate it. Bill Kristol, Tara Setmeyer, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think it was important to keep him in conversation about these issues, because as with any president, right, there are going to be people around a president who want to manipulate that president into certain decisions. I saw it as my job. Hey, give the president multiple options. He's the guy who got elected, right? He should have the choice. Nobody elected me. Nobody elected the secretaries of state or defense or anybody else. So the president should be able to determine his or her own agenda, make his or her own decisions. There's a second kind of group of people who are motivated differently in any administration, and these are people who have their own agenda. They came into the administration to get their stuff done, right? What they have in mind on trade or immigration, or you fill in the blank. And then there's a third group of people who, I think they define their role as saving the country and the world from the president. And the problem with those two latter groups, they don't serve the president well, but they also undermine the Constitution because sovereignty lies with the people. The people elected the president. The people didn't elect any of these other people. So I saw it as my role. This is one of the chapter titles, to guard his independence of judgment, and to do so by keeping him in conversation about this. There were a lot of sort of Iago figures, who were in his ear on certain issues all the time. And so it was important.
Can I just name them for that? I mean, remember, you're being very diplomatic, but you were there at the beginning of the administration when you had Steve Bannon there, who was constantly sort of in his ear, often undermining decisions that he had made through this process that you had created. Sure. Then Bannon would go in, give him an earful or others. Right. And you kind of write about each of those factions. Yes. And you do name them. And that was quite a tumultuous time at the beginning of the administration. Yeah.
The title is At War with Ourselves for a reason. So we were at war with ourselves inside of the West Wing, within the administration at times, but also those tensions, and what I write about in the book is they have their roots in sort of what is dividing us in our society today as well. And many of those factions were represented within, or people who were part of those factions
down the hall.
Were represented down the hall.
In the West Wing.
The hall.
Thank you so much to the 92Y for hosting this conversation. And joining me are Democratic strategist Jess McIntosh and Democratic Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Thanks to both of you for also being here for this conversation.
Thanks. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Well, look, let's get into it. We are 6 weeks from Election Day, and there has been so much attention on the 2024 presidential election. But I really want to start by asking both of you about the state of play for congressional elections. Are you seeing voter enthusiasm for these races? What are you seeing out there on the ground? Congresswoman Crockett, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I feel very confident that we're going to take the House, as we are currently dealing with the debt ceiling, not the debt ceiling. We're currently dealing with the budget. Y'all can tell I'm tired. But end of fiscal year is September 30th. We just saw that the speaker put a failed CR on the floor. And for those that don't know, a CR is nothing more than a Band-Aid. CR stands for continuing resolution, because we have to make decisions by September 30th. And so those decisions haven't been made. We don't have a budget. And right now we don't have a plan. So I guess we got concepts of a budget. Listen, I'm telling you that if they shut us down, this will absolutely seal their fate. But I think that they already see the writing on the wall, because it has been continual dysfunction out of the House. And so we know that the House Democratic candidates are a lot better. But in addition to that, they actually are doing really well on fundraising. And overall, DCCC has actually outraised the RNCC, or whatever they're called. We have consistently outraised them as well. So, I'm feeling really good, but I don't want anyone to let up, because we do have a lot of tight seats. We know that the Republicans control the House, and it was only a total of maybe like 8,000 votes total throughout the country that gave them control of the House. We know Lauren Boebert only won her seat by about 500 votes. So these races are going to be razor thin. So it is important that people know that no matter what, you got to show up and you got to vote all the way down the ballot, because we've got to make sure Hakeem Jeffries becomes the Speaker of the House.
Yeah. Jess, what would you add to that?
I mean, I can't imagine looking at the GOP House leadership and thinking like, yes, I would like more of that. This is exactly the kind of energy that we want to bring to the country. When you see the quality and caliber of congressional candidate and elected official in the Democratic Party, I was just in Chicago for the DNC. I got to see the Congresswoman's fabulous speech. I got to see so many of your colleagues' fabulous speech. I walked away feeling like the bench is deep. Like, we have a lot of people who got into this for all the right reasons. You're running because you want to solve problems. You're running because you're a member of your community who cares deeply about the people who live there. It's not about personal ambition. It's not about wanting to leapfrog to the next seat. It's literally about representing the people who matter the most to you. And that energy was so clearly on display, especially among the new generations of congressional candidates and elected officials. And I think there's real momentum there. They're the ones that are able to really connect with voters. People can feel great about Kamala Kamala Harris, and I love that people are feeling as great about the vice president as they are, but they're unlikely to meet her. You're pretty likely to meet your congressperson if you so choose. It's not hard. So those are really the opportunities where we can show, like, what does democratic leadership look like? What does a society that takes care of everybody look like, and prioritize a care economy and build a social safety net and make sure that everybody can live the kind of lives that they want to live, free from bullying and like, what does that look like? What does that vision look like? It's the people at the House level who are most likely to be able to communicate that directly to voters, and it's a really important job.
Yeah, I mean, Congresswoman Crockett, you're making such a good point about, we're in the middle of, there's no such thing as election day anymore. We're at the start of election season, right? People are already beginning to cast their ballots early, starting this month. And so as people are seeing kind of this dysfunction once again in Congress, this fight over a potential government shutdown, it is a reminder of the work that Congress does, and also of the importance of the role of Congress in how our country is governed. I think about that. I think about Amber Thurman, this 28-year-old medical assistant and mother who was found to be the first abortion-related death after the fall of Roe in 2022. She dies after she is unable to get care in her home state of Georgia after complications from an abortion. These kinds of reminders of how government policy really has a direct effect on people's lives, I would have to imagine is on the minds of people as they go to the ballot box, not only for the top of the ticket, but also for a lot of these congressional races. Yes?
Oh, absolutely. And I would even go further than that. I would say all the way down the ballot, because we have the Ambers of the world that are struggling. And unfortunately, she won't be the first, nor will she be the last. There are other names that haven't been revealed yet, but I can guarantee you that there are other women that have died because no one had to stoke the fears. We had history, because there are those of us that believe in studying history. We had history. We know what type of worlds we lived in pre-Roe, and right now they've taken us back there. And with the ridiculous draconian state houses, it's important that we vote up and down the ticket. And so while I know that all the focus is on the top, and Lord knows that I want Kamala Harris to become the next president of the United States, I want to make sure that she has the assistance and the help that she needs to execute the mission and the vision that she has for us. And that means that she needs a democratically controlled House. She needs a democratically controlled Senate, so that she can hopefully begin to save lives and begin to heal this country. It is so frustrating to me because Amber should be here. She didn't have to die. And to die because you become somebody's political pawn is one of the most insidious things that I can imagine. And granted, we have had so many people die because they've been political pawns, whether it's the women that are now struggling to not have access to the healthcare that they need, or whether we're even talking about our LGBTQIA community, specifically our trans kids. We know that there's a higher incidence of homelessness. We know that there's a higher incidence of self-harm overall that takes place with this community of beautiful people, but they are constantly under attack. And a lot of times they're under attack by the people that were elected to protect them. So I will say that, as people go and cast their ballots, and when I say people, I mean that, because the fight for reproductive access is not a fight that is limited to women of reproductive age. It is a fight for all of us. The theme of this campaign is freedom, because it is about freedom. If you don't understand the intersectionalities, if you don't realize that if they can say what I can and can't do with my body, then there's nothing that can be done to stop them from doing the exact same thing to you. I mean, I made sure that I pointed this out in a hearing where I decided that I was going to talk about Viagra, because don't think that somebody can't come for you if they want to, right? That's the very simplistic terms. But we've seen so many of our other freedoms, whether it's access to the ballot box, whether it's access to a full and rich education that includes all of our history, or whether we're talking about even being able to access an education with the overturning of the affirmative action decision. I need people to understand that you can sit quiet or silent if you want to, but at the end of the day, there is a right that you most likely will care about And it potentially will be on the chopping block by the same group of people that have decided that they wanted to chop away at our rights. And finally, if you love anyone who is a woman, you should care about this. Or a young girl who may become a woman. We shouldn't live in a world, not in the United States, where a little girl can be impregnated and be forced to carry. We shouldn't live in a world where we know that there's not a viable fetus and someone be forced to carry. We should not live in a world where women have to bleed out in the parking lot of a hospital before they can get the care that they need. We shouldn't live in a world where someone is going to be detrimentally impacted financially and be told that this is what you're going to have to do, or be told, we don't really care if you were raped, you're going to have to do this, because we had approximately 26,000 pregnancies as a result of rape in the state of Texas alone after the overturning of Roe. This is a matter that affects all of us, and we need to look at it that way.
Now, we call it a foundational right because it's the foundation that a lot of other things sit on. And when you lose it, you realize that you're not just losing your freedom to decide your own reproductive fate, you're losing your freedom to decide your career, you're losing your freedom to family plan, you're losing your freedom to freely move about the country. I mean, like a woman in her late 30s who has a wanted pregnancy is now worried about taking a job in certain states because she might not be able to get the care she needs if something goes wrong. There are so many freedoms, just the idea of like living in America and being free to do the things that we want to do. We're not when we don't have this right. And I think, feminists have been saying this for a long time. Women in leadership have been saying this for a long time. And for a long time, we were dismissed as sort of, this is their political play. They do this every time for the base. This isn't actually going to happen. And if it does, it won't actually be that bad because it's not the 1970s anymore. And now we're here. And now it's worse than we had that terrible story about the 10-year-old in Ohio who was impregnated by rape almost immediately after the fall of Roe, like within a couple of days. Because these terrible things happen, and we need protections to make sure that lives aren't further lost and endangered. And yes, thank you. We really need men to be talking about this. We know that it matters to them. We can tell. We see it on the doors. We see it in the focus groups. We know that they care. We need them to talk. We need them to talk to their friends. Men need to hear from other men about how important this issue is. To them and their families. That's going to give them the permission structure that they need to really show up for us in the way that we need them to, frankly. If women could do this alone, I think we probably would already.
Yeah, Let me just add one more thing that I forgot that I did. It just wasn't top of mind. So recently I had a constituent that came into the office, and this constituent actually owns an amazing organization that is consistently helping women who are single and pregnant and really need wraparound services, but mostly need housing and they need support. And something that I hadn't thought about is, number one, everyone that we know is talking about the housing crisis. Everyone is talking about the cost of rent. They're talking about the cost of home ownership. We know that the vice president has a plan to help those that are trying to move in and become first-time homebuyers. But here was the part that I had never considered that is blowing my mind. She tells me that she's getting somewhere between 12 and 15 calls a day, and this is just in Dallas, for women that are in need of assistance that have become pregnant. That's number one. So she's seen this huge spike in need. But she told me about a woman that is 48 years old, and she was unhoused. And so she was in her unhoused situation. She ends up pregnant. She's 48. So it's an unhoused woman. I don't know the details of how she got pregnant, but we already know 48, she's super duper high risk, right? And she doesn't have healthcare. She doesn't have access to all these things. And now she also needs housing, because what she was willing to do with just herself is one thing. But now bringing forth a child into this world, she's like, I need assistance. further exacerbating the housing crisis, something that I hadn't thought about.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that can live alone or go live somewhere else. But when you start talking about, oh, I've got a child with me, they are limited in the access to the housing, which further exacerbates our housing crisis. So, I mean, the layers and the levels to this are just insurmountable, the things that I hadn't even conceptualized.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at is, I mean, I'm seeing how animated you are thinking about this. I mean, you are responding to a constituent as a member of Congress around this issue, while, kind of at the top level, there are these conversations about, could Congress potentially, pass a federal ban or pass federal protections for abortion, but on a very constituent level, this is an issue that you all are also dealing with. And so I wonder, obviously this theme of freedom is something on the Democratic ticket that has been the Democratic presidential ticket that has been a theme, but the theme of freedom at the congressional level and some of these congressional races also sounds like a message that could resonate with voters in some of those races. And also, to your point, Jess, being that this is the first presidential election since the fall of Roe, but for 2 years, abortion has been on the ballot for millions of voters in some of these congressional races. And, so men are also being asked to answer, like voters are expecting candidates to articulate their positions on abortion, no matter who they are.
Yes, they absolutely are. And I would point out that where abortion has been directly on the ballot in 7 states, and these are states like Vermont, blue states like Vermont, and very, very red states like Montana and Kansas, 7 for 7, abortion access has won. It's very clear where the American population is on this. It is an extreme minority. They just happen to have consolidated power in all of the ways that they need to, via gerrymandering, via the courts, via places like the Heritage Foundation and the Project 2025 think tank folks. Like, they're not the majority of us. The majority of us really do want families making these decisions, not politicians. They understand that the decision when and whether to grow your family is intensely personal. They might have all kinds of complicated and nuanced feelings about it for themselves, but they don't want politicians making this decision. They're really pretty clear on that. You can, when you test the numbers for people who are in favor of reproductive freedom, that number changes wildly depending on how you ask the question, right? It's like 60 to 80%, depending on how you phrase it. When you ask who wants a total ban, that number is like 6% all the time, no matter what. It's an extreme minority of people that want the draconian measures that the House GOP is trying to push. And because of gerrymandering, the House GOP has gotten so extreme, so far to the right, that they are now completely in charge of the thing, and they are kind of forced to cater to this group of constituents that is not at all representative of the rest of us. So what you wound up is with this minority of people having outsized power to be able, in an undemocratic way, to put their agenda on a much larger group of people that all agree this is a decision that families should be able to make by themselves without the aid of politicians.
Yeah, which again goes to that freedom theme, which could be resonating not just at the top of the ticket, but really for elections up and down the ballot as people are thinking about freedom and who controls the amount of freedom that they are able to have, right? But in terms of the policies that are created, that are having a direct impact on their lives. Well, look, I'm going to shift gears to talk about the issue of immigration. Because it's been in the spotlight in presidential campaign politics after Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance continues to spread a racist hoax about Haitian immigrants in the community of Springfield, Ohio. I'm wondering how the issue of immigration is playing out in congressional races. I'm also thinking about, just the idea that members of Congress, again, so much closer to constituents that could be targeted in this way, right? We're seeing that. How much of an issue do you think immigration is going to be in some of these congressional contests? Congresswoman Crockett, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think it just depends on where you are.
whether or not it really plays out. You know, people always are very presumptuous and think that it's a big deal in my race because I'm Texas and no one ever asked me about immigration. I mean, granted, we have a lot of immigration cases that are in my district, but I think that, I mean, Texas is a border state. So we've consistently kind of, you know, had immigration be at the forefront of our minds to the extent that it's always there. So it's kind of just a part of who we are, even though it's our Texas governor that is stoking so much nonsense and whatever. Same thing with Florida. Like, it's not rare for immigrants to be in Florida or Texas, like considering their geographical location. But they have decided that they really want this new punching bag. I think, though, that we are going to see a lot of the racist rhetoric backfire. And you call it a hoax. I just call it a straight up lie. Because JD Vance admitted that, like, he will make things up if it means that he'll get attention. And I think that people really have to ask yourself, like, is this somebody that you can trust with being like a heartbeat away from the presidency? And can you trust this team and trust them to have access to the nuclear codes when they will make up any, like, we have to trust our leaders. And honestly, they're not giving us a reason to trust them at all. But I want to say that the reason I feel like it's going to backfire is because when we think about Florida and we think about the margins in races in Florida, I think the margins are going to be tighter than they historically have been in recent times because they have the ballot initiative as it relates to reproductive access. And because they didn't want it to pass, they raised the threshold. So it's a 60% threshold on that. It's a 60% threshold on marijuana, and both of them are on the ballot. So number one, you've got all this investment that's coming to the state because of these ballot initiatives that potentially wouldn't necessarily be there. And then because you decided that you wanted to go over 50%, I think that that probably is only going to help us. But you add to that the large population of Haitians that are right there in Florida. And you don't have to be in Springfield, Ohio to be pissed off or mad as hell that you're going after these Haitians that are legally in the United States and working and contributing to the economy right there in Springfield, Ohio. And honestly, Ohio has kind of been one of those that we've kind of brushed off for a number of years as well. I think that Ohio may end up being in play as well, even though they don't necessarily have the largest population of Haitians, because of all the hell that has come to the community in general with the bomb threats and things like that. Coming straight from the top of the other ticket, people that potentially were going one way or thought maybe, you know what, I'll sit this one out. They may be saying, you know what, my child should be able to go to school and be just fine without being targeted by the people that are trying to lead our country. Not to mention Sherrod Brown is also on the ballot running for the Senate seat. So I think that they may actually end up putting Ohio and Florida into play because they decided that they wanted to play games.
100%. You don't have to be Haitian to be absolutely outraged by what's happening here. And there's a movement in Springfield that is about, it's about their community. It's about the Haitians who are in their community, who they want to be in their community, but it's also about the schools. It's about all of the kids who are going to the schools. It's about all of these public buildings that are now not safe. I mean, it doesn't really matter what color you are in Springfield, Ohio right now. You don't feel good about going out. That's awful. Like that honestly, it's bringing them all together. It's making us all, like, we're all Springfield. We all get that. That could be happening in any town in America right now, as long as Donald Trump and JD Vance wanted it to. So when you have Republican mayors and elected officials standing up and saying, yeah, I actually don't want Trump to come to my state. I would actually be really cool with this ticket not at all stopping in Ohio. That really speaks to what you're saying, that people, I mean, those were probably locked Republican votes, considering that they are Republican elected officials. And I'm going to guess when those men get in the ballot box, if they go this year, they're going to vote their conscience. I think there are a lot of, I hope that there are a lot of Republicans who are going to do that, especially after this. But demonizing immigrants is a very, very old racist playbook. We see it in some new version every cycle. This is just one of the most egregious that I have lived through, but it's not new. This is what they do, and it's because they can't talk about their leadership on this issue or much of anything else.
Well, I want to ask you both too. I'm going to stick with you, Jess, to start about issues and races that we should be watching that maybe are not on people's radar headed into November. What are the issues? What are the races that you are looking at right now?
Okay, well, I do have like a little bit of a bugaboo about races that people aren't paying enough attention to, because I'm a New Yorker, and so if you live in New York or California, you sort of have this idea that like your politics are taken care of, and people will come to you for fundraisers, but they're not anything else, and we need to worry about Ohio, we need to worry about Florida, and I just want to explode that as thoroughly as I possibly can because we need to worry about our own backyards. The control of the House rests on New York and California. The swing districts in those states are the reason why we don't have control today, and they will be the reason why we don't this November unless we get it right. So I want all of the New Yorkers and all of the Californians who care, and there are tons of them, there are tons of us, who feel like, well, I'm sitting here in this blue state, what am I going to do? An hour away, 45 minutes away, 1 hour north, there are doors you can knock. There are people, call every single human being you know in your own state and make sure that they know how critical the congressional races in our states are. This is one of the few times where I can say, just look to your own backyard, please.
Yeah, that's so interesting. In this year's Battle for Congress, the battlegrounds might look a little bit different. Well, I want to also talk about the reality that Congress is becoming increasingly diverse. Folks like you, Congresswoman Crockett, coming to Congress, helping to contribute to now a record number of Black women soon to be in Congress. And that is due in large part, not just to the recent organizing efforts of women, people of color, marginalized groups, but people from those communities who are standing for and winning elected office. Can we just talk about what it means for us to say representation matters in terms of our members of Congress bringing their lived experiences to the campaign trail and policymaking?
Yeah, so one of the things that I always talk about is diversity, and you and I have had a chance to talk about this and make it very plain and simple, right? When we can understand why it matters to have a diverse portfolio and recognize that there are just different angles and strengths that different portions of your portfolio may bring, while another one may be weak in other areas, it's the exact same thing. We get the best of the best. We are strongest when we are diverse, because my lived experiences aren't someone else's, and diversity is not limited to color. I do want to be clear, right? Diversity is all about, can you offer something that is different from the base, right? Like the quote unquote baseline. And so it is going to be women. It is going to be people from the LGBTQIA community. It is going to be immigrants. It is going to be someone that is from rural America, someone that's from urban America. It is trying to combine everything that we are in this country and make sure that no one is left out of the conversation. Because again, you know, some of the things that we've talked about as it relates specifically to the Haitians, it has been interesting to hear the perspective of the only Haitian American that we have in Congress. We also only have one Palestinian American in Congress. And so as things have been playing out, it is important to know, because their lived experiences are nothing like mine. Today in a hearing, we had someone basically speaking and trying to justify and explain why the Haitians should have been enslaved for another 30 years, and then their lives would have been better. That was what was put out there, okay? I mean, this is the kind of talk that we get from certain people. So it is important that you have people that are like, no, let me break down like how horrific like slavery is in general, but let me tell you about the slavery of like my people, right? So it is important that we have the diversity, and I'm excited to say that I am in a historic class where there are 6 Black women. Each and every single one of us came in super qualified for our positions, even though we came in quite young on average when you look at our age. And so we've got 3 former state senators and 3 former state House members. So we all came in with legislative experience, ready to go, and it's been fantastic. And so 6 has been the record. And with the special election win on yesterday, we're about to add our 7th Black woman to the count. So I'm really excited, and I'm thankful for the support that we all have received from the community as a whole that has been very appreciative of us showing up just as we are every day to our jobs.
Well, last question to both of you, just in terms of what you think this election is going to come down to, especially as we talk about the battle for control of Congress. And do you feel like voters are enthusiastic and galvanized, not just at the top of the ticket, but to weigh in on who will control Congress in 2025 and beyond?
You know, I want to give the Congresswoman the last word, so I'll start and say that I think voters are more tuned in to how our government works than I have ever seen before. I've been working in politics for 20 years at every level, from school board to US president, and there is a lot of voter education that has to happen because we don't have civic education in our schools largely any longer. As our rights are being taken away, people are learning how that's happening. So it's not just Congress, although they are certainly understanding that on a new level. It's things like you have a state Supreme Court. Everybody knows repro rights are on the ballot, but they're on the ballot in different places in different states. Sometimes it's about your state legislature. Sometimes it's about your state Supreme Court. Sometimes it's about Congress and whether or not you're going to pass a federal ban. So there's all kinds of mechanisms at play in our democracy and our system of self-governance. And they can be a little opaque, but I think we're starting to really understand, honestly, thanks to the leadership of some of the younger generation of elected officials like Congresswoman Crockett, who like open the curtain and just explain it to people like the way they need to hear it. That's what we need, and I'm starting to see that happen. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm, but there's also a lot of knowledge that I haven't seen before, and I'm excited. I'm nauseously optimistic, as we've been saying, to see how it happens in November.
Thank you so much, Jess, for everything that you just said. I agree. And going back to the diversity conversation, you know, it's another reason that diversity matters, because we communicate in different ways, our communication styles, right? And so, you know, while we all may have the substance, and I absolutely believe that so many of us, especially on the Democratic side, we come with the substance, but we communicate in different ways. And so there are different audiences that pick up on what it is that we're saying. And so I do think that my class for sure has been on fire. And I think that they have piqued the curiosity of the people, and they want to see more and they want to know more. And I do think that that's been really helpful, especially when you're like, oh, you've got Maxwell Frost, he was 25. Like, what's going on? Wait a minute. We thought you had to be at least 70 before you could get into the club. Like, you know, it's like one of those things. Or then it's like, wait a minute, like Jazz done all this other stuff, but like she still talks like me. Like, what's happening? Right? Like, wait a minute, she doesn't have to. So I do think that the House, in fact, we have numbers that show us to have the highest favorability numbers the House Democrats have historically ever had, right? Usually everybody just hates the entire House. And so we are actually faring really, really well. And I do think it's because, as Jess kind of alluded to a lot earlier, she talked about the DNC. And the one thing that you saw from the DNC that you did not see from the RNC is that we have a bench. A lot of times people are like, oh, well, they believe we don't have a bench because we're sitting there, we're like, well, who's going to run? Who's going to run for this? And it's like, no, we have a bench. Now, whether or not we lay out the plans very well is a whole other issue. But we do have like this deep bench. And I think that it's one of the things that's probably benefited the Harris Walz ticket the most, is that the principals are out there working and they're doing everything that they can. But we know that this ticket has been running for a lot shorter amount of time than the other ticket. And so it's a matter of they can't get everywhere and talk to everybody. But let me tell you, they've got some amazing surrogates that they can put on the ground. Donald Trump, his people won't show up unless it's him. They don't even want to show up for J.D. Vance. But I can tell you, people get just, I'm not going to say they get just as excited when they see me, but they do get excited and they're ready to show up for me, as well as Maxwell, as well as Robert Garcia, as well as Hakeem Jeffries, as well as Elizabeth Warren, and the list goes on. There's just so many amazing Democrats that we have. And so what you're seeing is that we are always willing to work as one team. And we've got Coach Walz calling the plays. We've got, Kamala Harris quarterbacking this thing. And, you got all the receivers and the runners that you could want. But let me tell you, this won't be a one-man show they're running a one-man show against us, an entire team. And when we win, it will be because we all decided that we were going to work together, and Team Blue is working for all people. So it's been fantastic chatting with you. You are amazing. Thank you, Jess. Thank you for pointing out that our path to the House comes straight through New York and Cali. And I hear you. I went to Inglewood just a week and a half ago, and I was campaigning, and I was telling them, a crowd of 50,000 people, that I know y'all not seeing that many politicians because y'all are blue, and I appreciate that. But I need you to still show up and tell your friends, because as I told them, I need some better coworkers because some of them is raggedy. And then I made sure that I mentioned that Bleach Blonde may be leading the pack of the raggedy ones. So the people were excited and understood what I was putting down. So I am looking for great things out of California as well as New York.
Wow. Well, we will definitely be staying tuned to what you continue to do on the campaign trail and in Congress, Congresswoman Crockett. And Jess, thank you so much for your insights 6 weeks ago. And, so much on the line. And I think the stakes of this are definitely evident in what happens with the future of Congress. So thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you to the 92nd Street Y, New York, for hosting this State of America Summit. And thank you to everyone out there tuning in for this particular panel on the future of the Supreme Court. My name is Madiba K. Denny. I am the author of The Originalism Trap: How Extremists Stole the Constitution and How We the People Can Take It Back. And I'm the deputy editor and senior contributor at the critical legal commentary outlet Balls and Strikes. My most important role today, however, is moderator. I am delighted to be joined by three of the country's foremost experts on law and democracy, and would like to briefly introduce our panelists. Kenji Yoshino is the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law at NYU School of Law, as well as the Director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. Wilfred Codrington III is the Walter Florsheimmer Professor of Constitutional Law at Cardozo School of Law and co-director of the Florsheimmer Center for Constitutional Democracy. And Justin Levitt is a professor of law and the Gerald T. McLaughlin Fellow at LMU Loyola Law School, where he recently returned after serving as the White House's first senior policy advisor for democracy and voting rights. Thank you all for being here today. I also want to acknowledge on record that I dramatically shortened all of your bios, because otherwise I would be listing accolades all day and we have business to attend to. So today we'll be speaking about the ways the court is reshaping American democracy, and also how democratic processes could or should be used to reshape the Supreme Court. This topic takes on a heightened importance at present because with the start of early voting in a few states, we are officially actively in the 2024 election. This election may in some ways be a referendum on the Supreme Court's past, and it will undeniably impact the court's future. So my first question for the group relates to the immediate future of the court. The court's new term is about to begin, and recent terms have been explosive, including rescinding the constitutional right to abortion, sharply curtailing administrative agencies' ability to do the jobs delegated to them by Congress, and granting the president expansive immunity from criminal prosecution. So my question for whoever feels like taking this one first is, what on earth is the court going to do to us now? What do you expect from this upcoming term?
I'm happy to jump in and take a whack at that. First of all, Madiba, thank you so much for moderating. Thank you so much to my esteemed colleagues, and thank you to the 92nd Street Y for hosting this incredible summit. So I would say, there's one case that I have my eye on. I do think it is a sleepier term, thank goodness, than it was last term. But one blockbuster case that the Supreme Court has taken has to do with the constitutionality of bans on gender-affirming care for trans individuals. So this is a Tennessee statute that restricts the gender-affirming care that such youth can receive. There were, district court opinions on this, but most recently, Jeffrey Sutton, who is a very eminent Sixth Circuit judge, former Scalia clerk, wrote saying there is no equal protection kind of guarantee that would protect individuals from such a ban. This is going to be a very interesting one to watch at the Supreme Court because, as many of our listeners know, in 2020, the Supreme Court handed down a kind of surprise civil rights victory in the Bostock case, where it said that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which bans discrimination on the basis of sex, also prohibited by that definition discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. So that was a statutory decision. Whether or not that statutory analysis would extend over into the context of the constitutional analysis is something that I think we're all going to be watching for. As a civil rights guy, I should also say some of the omissions are really interesting too. So the case that didn't make it, where the Supreme Court denied review, which was very interesting to me, was the TJ versus Fairfax County case, which was one of these top 10% type programs that was intended to advance race-based affirmative action, in my view. I think there are differing opinions on that, but didn't do it through facial race-based discrimination. So in the same way that the University of Texas had a program that said if you graduate in the top 10% of your class, you have automatic admission into the UT system, so too did this magnet school say if you graduate in the top X% of a particular zip code, then you have admission into our magnet school. What they were trying to do is to reverse the spin of residential segregation. This obviously could run afoul of the Students for Fair Admissions case that the Supreme Court decided in June of 2023. But the Supreme Court decided it wasn't going to take it, and it didn't want to delve into the kind of what does pretext mean? What does it mean when there's a facially neutral statute? So even what my colleague Melissa Murray calls a YOLO court, right, is sort of saying like, we've done enough in this area. We're not going to reach out and grab this, let SFFA kind of percolate through the system for a few more years before we deal with the issues of pretext. So I'll stop there. One case that they did take, one case that they didn't, both extremely consequential decisions.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for flagging those. Just some immediate things that came to mind are, it makes me wonder to what extent the ban on gender affirming care for youth case would be an entry point, because to me it just sort of sets off alarm bells like, oh, for abortion we're coming for a certain number of weeks at gestation, or oh, we're coming for this particular type of program. So is this a sort of first step to then going to we're banning gender affirming care, period? So I just wanted to flag that. But Wilfred, I cut you off. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, of course. And I'll co-sign everything that Kenji just said. And thank you, Madiba, for moderating this conversation. I'll also just pick up where Kenji left off too, about something that the court hasn't taken. And so just today, the Supreme Court declined to weigh in on an election suit. So there was a case in Nevada about whether the Green Party would be included on the ballot, and the Nevada Supreme Court said no. The Supreme Court said, we're going to go with that opinion. So it did not step in. But I'm concerned, I guess, if I sort of extrapolate some, what's going to happen that we don't know, right? Things that come up on the emergency docket, what many are calling the shadow docket, because it consists of, emergency petitions, things that are very time sensitive, but also things that are not argued before the court properly, always presented in the proper light before the court, and therefore can make some pretty bad ruling because you don't have the facts and the records before you in the way that you do in a fully developed merits case. And so we saw this kind of play out over the summer, I guess, twice. I kind of think about this. So when we think about the shadow docket, I'm concerned as an election law scholar about the Purcell principle. The Purcell principle is this principle that the Supreme Court derived, Rick Hassan named it, but from a 2006 case. It basically says that in the lead up to elections, courts shouldn't be changing the rules because we're concerned about, disenfranchisement and voter confusion and the things that can happen when you change rules close to the election. Well, in one case earlier this summer, the Supreme Court rightfully, I think, declined to sort of take a very curious Purcell argument seriously by the state of Missouri. The attorney general there basically said, in loosening the gag order in Trump's New York criminal trial and his case, that was changing the election rules somehow in a way that interfered with the electors in Missouri. It was very curious, and I think, therefore, the court rightfully booted it. But the Supreme Court did not invoke the Purcell principle in a more recent case in Arizona. And so Arizona, you have, people pushing this idea that is totally unfounded, that there are scores and scores and scores and millions of people voting who are ineligible because they are not citizens. And so they're passing laws that basically the Supreme Court has let go into effect, a rule change that bifurcates elections in the state of Arizona. So you can vote sort of in federal elections if you use a federal form, and you can vote in all elections if you use the state form with some sorts of IDs that are pretty strict. And so, I am really concerned about how the Supreme Court is or is not, I tend to think, being principled in the way that it intervenes in election cases. And that's what I'm watching.
And I'll jump in to both co-sign the thanks that everybody gave to you and to the 92nd Street Y, but also to say, the cases and the absence of cases that both Kenji and Wilfred have noted were also high on my list. One of the other features of the shadow docket that Wilfred mentioned is that not only are cases presented in emergency posture, without briefing, without facts, exactly as he said, they're usually issued without an opinion. That is, it's just a ruling, thumbs up or thumbs down. It's kind of like ancient Roman Caesar, and you don't know the why, and that's left an awful lot of lower courts, appellate courts, trying to figure out what the Supreme Court could have meant, interpolating. The Supreme Court hasn't decided a case based on Purcell, based on this notion that you got to be careful changing the rules too late in the game. Hasn't actually decided a case with reasoning since 2006, since that original case. And all we're left with are trying to read some very inadequate tea leaves in a way that speaks more to Supreme Court's assertion of power than development of law. I think a really disturbing development on the court. I hope that we're done with these cases for the moment, looking forward for the next couple months, but you can never be sure, as Wilfred said. There's one other case that I want to point to for the next term. So Kenji's absolutely right. There are some big blockbuster cases that everybody will recognize as blockbuster cases. The Supreme Court has also, in recent past, been making law in really significant ways through sleeper cases, through cases that don't look big but are. And there's one of those in particular. There are a couple, but there's one that I'm watching for this coming term called Lackey versus Stinney, about the ability of civil rights groups to get attorney's fees for civil rights claims. It's not a typical civil rights posture. It's a case against the DMV, and essentially trying to get attorney's fees for a partial temporary improvement by the DMV. But it presents a vehicle to the court to seriously cut back on and curtail the ways in which civil rights groups can get fees. And that, in turn, has the potential to change a big part of the structure of how civil rights cases are brought flat out. I don't know that there's been that much public attention on this issue, but it's going to be big when it comes, one way or another, and is one of a series of cases like that.
Justin, I would love for you to elaborate a little on why folks should care about attorney's fees. I feel like folks will be like, oh, it impacts how some lawyers are getting paid. Okay. But it has actually serious consequences for civil rights law.
It does. And it's a great reminder. So yeah, it's going to impact how some attorneys get paid, but the attorneys in these questions are bringing cases that nobody else will bring. The civil rights laws were designed to protect people's ability to hold the government to account, to make sure that state and local government were responsive to federal law, and to make sure that federal government was responsive to federal law. And the problem with those over a long series of years was that there wasn't enough incentive to bring those cases, because for any individual, most of the time, it was too much of a hassle, it was too expensive, it was too long and uncertain in duration to actually vindicate individual claims. And even if you can get a group of people together, the cases were complex and you couldn't find counsel who could make a living bringing those cases. And so they just didn't get brought. The statutes were on the books, but they were radically under-enforced. A few decades ago, and it was only a few decades ago, Congress decided to fix that by passing a statute saying if you win a civil rights case, your lawyers get paid, and they can get paid by the government entity that's violating civil rights. And that all of a sudden made it possible for nonprofit organizations of all kinds, of all ideological stripes, and with all kinds of different issues at the prominent at their forefront. And I got to emphasize, civil rights cases are not Democratic or Republican. They are not progressive or conservative. They deal with people's civil rights. So a lot of different groups bring them. The statute says if you bring one of these and you win, your attorneys get paid, and that's less about the attorneys bringing the case and far more about the incentive to hold governments to account for violating federal laws than they otherwise had been. So it's a very big deal structurally in making sure that we all get the rights that we're promised in practice.
Thank you for that. I also wanted to backtrack just a hot second. We were talking about the Purcell principle earlier, and something you had mentioned, I think you had said this, Wilford, that the case was decided in 2006. So it seems pretty recent for a 2006 case to now be this whole full-fledged principle. Like if it were a person, it couldn't get into a bar yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's characteristic of how this court has been moving since then, right? We think of constitutional law as sort of being a slower moving, or at least we thought of it as being pretty slow in terms of its movement. And this court seems to really be on the express train, right? And this was highlighted in a number of cases, but we saw that again in all of these cases attacking the administrative and regulatory state, right? We've just recently had these rulings in the past few terms that are really, like, I really hope that Kenji is right, that there is a pause on eviscerating this apparatus. But, we've seen the creation of the major questions doctrine. We've seen the invalidating of core aspects of agency civil enforcement and adjudication. We've seen equitable tolling to allow for pop-up organizations to sort of attack longstanding rules. And of course, we've seen this major decision that overturned Chevron versus EPA and Loper Bright. And so it's just, I think, the age and the speed and the clip with which this court is moving is unquestionably fast. And so it's not surprising that Purcell has taken on that characteristic as well. I am just more afraid of, that one even more so, as Justin said, we're not getting reasoned opinions explaining why it morphs and it is applied in ways that it is. And so it leaves us reading tea leaves. And I looked at this in a couple articles, including like during the pandemic, how the court has been particularly unbalanced or sort of irrational in the ways that it was applying a Purcell, including in ways that disenfranchised many people during the pandemic. And so I'm afraid that we're starting to see that we could see things like this happen again, and we won't know until voting is further underway. It is underway, mind you, so get out there and vote.
And if I may, I want to clarify that, I wish that I could confidently say that the Supreme Court was pumping the brakes on this. But to my mind, the TJ case was really the exception that proves the rule, where, they did show some restraint. One of the things that Justice Breyer, after his retirement, of course, was saying about this court is just, please slow down. Like, this is not good for confidence in the rule of law to have so many areas of law be upended, all at once. So as my colleagues are saying, if you look at the Dobbs case, that is, 4 decades of jurisprudence, more than that, I suppose, since Roe v. Wade. Really, I suppose 50. It's 4 decades of jurisprudence that are being upended in the SFFA case, the affirmative action case. It's 4 decades of jurisprudence that are being upended in the abolition of the Chevron doctrine. So in domain after domain after domain, this is again why my colleague, Professor Murray, calls this the you only live once YOLO court. They just really seem to be moving at warp speed. And that attached to the really important thing that Wilfred was saying of, and Justin as well, of just not giving reasoned opinions, that not giving reasoned opinions in the emergency docket really does contribute to the polarization of our country. One of the things about, the forum of principles, my former colleague Ronald Dworkin used to say, of the Supreme Court is that it gave reasoned opinions, and it was required to give us reasons for why it had arrived at a particular decision. So even if I vehemently disagreed, I would be able to actually find, the reasons that led the court to its decision, so that I understood that this wasn't just completely a diktat or peremptory on the part of the court. And so we already live in a very polarized nation for reasons that don't have anything to do with the court, but the court is certainly not helping that polarization by saying to one side, you absolutely lose, and we don't even have the obligation to explain to you why we believe you should lose.
Can I just pick up on something that Kenji just mentioned? So he's absolutely right that we live in a very polarized nation for mostly reasons that don't have to do with the court. But some of those reasons absolutely do have to do with the court, not only the substance of their decisions, but how they got there. There are 5 justices on the court right now who received votes from a majority of senators, but representing a minority of the population. And I think they're the only 5 in history out of more than 100 Supreme Court justices who were put on the court with ratification votes of senators who represent less than half of the public. And 3 of those, I don't have to tell anybody here, put there based on some pretty controversial proceedings in the Senate, just in terms of normal process. So the individual justices, I think, are contributing to some of the polarization through their opinions, not exclusively by any stretch. There are a lot of things contributing to that factor. But the way that they got there is also not helping, right? It used to be that even sharply distinct justices with sharply distinct ideologies were reasoned enough that they could command the votes of senators representing a majority of the public. And at least for 5 members of the current court, that's a lot. And again, the only ever. That's not true right now. That's not helping.
And that's just on the back end, mind you. That's the Senate. Remember, they were appointed by presidents who didn't win the popular vote. And so that makes it super minoritarian in that regard. And so we should be particularly concerned about that aspect.
I think you all have flagged a couple different things here. There's the idea of how protected from majority views the Supreme Court is, with these like double layers of insulation because of the minority confirmation process. We've also talked about the Supreme Court acting really rapidly and recklessly, and not even necessarily explaining itself when it's doing these things that really are shrinking other people's rights or other agencies' powers and seemingly expanding its own power. So with these problems in mind, I would love to hear from you all, like what do you think about the amount of power that the Supreme Court holds, and what kind of remedies might you like to see to shrink that power?
I'll jump in and say I'm very concerned, right? The Supreme Court was supposed to be the least dangerous branch. That's what the framers thought. And so, Congress, Article 1, which is supposed to be doing the governing, they were afraid that that was going to be a branch that overshadowed the power of the court and the presidency. And we've seen, the president has grown expansively, and even more the court. It's become sort of imperial, as some scholars are saying at this point, right? Because of the reasons that we're discussing. And so I think that that is really problematic. And I think that there are 3 things that we could also kind of look to in terms of trying to sort of set out what's going on here, right? We have like this loss of trust that's going on with the court because several things, right? We have ethical scandals that are swirling around them. There's, yacht trips, jet trips, camping trips, maybe submersible trips. I don't know what's next, right? But I certainly, the justices shouldn't be taking trips from people who any range of people, including people who have business before the court, and in amounts that are, multiple factors times what the average American even gets paid, right? That's really deeply concerning. There's these sort of flag wars. Like on the one hand, you have spouses of one justice sort of flying metaphorical flags about insurrection on January 6th. And then you have other ones actually flying insurrectionist flags and spats with neighbors about who knows what. And so there's these ethical questions, and this concerns who's going to be arguing before the court and their relationship to members of the court, and there's no recusals happening or explanations for why there's no recusals happening when people ask about this. So I see that sort of ethical problem as like a real issue on top of all the other ones. And so what do we do about it? Well, I think we can think about like matters of jurisdiction, right? And so jurisdiction is this idea of what the court can hear and must hear, right? There's original jurisdiction, there's appellate jurisdiction. These are regulated by the scant words in Article 3 of the Constitution. So Congress can regulate the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Some people have really talked about narrowing the Supreme Court's jurisdiction or stripping it. Maybe that's right. I also think of ways that we might want to expand the Supreme Court's jurisdiction, right? Because there's an appellate jurisdiction aspect that allows the Supreme Court to cherry pick which cases it's going to take from the federal courts and which cases it's going to take from state Supreme Courts. And I think that that's really problematic, to Justin's point about the polarization factor. We can choose our sort of issues that we want to decide and how sort of big we're going to go on the decisions. That's going to inflame things. So maybe we think about expanding, but we also can think about, again, jurisdictional sort of issues and the way that they manage their docket about the shadow docket. So requiring some explanation for the decisions that they make, including as they're making these big doctrinal changes and changing canon through unexplained and unreasoned opinions. So I'll stop there and let others jump in, but I really see that reform are like, that's the approach.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Wilfred. Thank you so much for that. So, I mean, with regard to the ethics reforms, this seems like a complete no-brainer. It used to be the argument of, yes, lower courts are bound by these rules, but who will guard the guardians, right? There's no one to appeal to if the Supreme Court is accused of an ethics violation, and so there's no comfortable place to go. I've been really heartened by Justice Elena Kagan coming to NYU and saying, there's no reason that really needs to be the case. We could have a panel of trusted lower court federal judges who would hear these cases. And you really can't have a rule that has no teeth. That just undermines the idea of the rule of law. So the Supreme Court, with much fanfare, announced a set of rules, right, that are not the federal recusal, rules that bind the lower courts, but its own rules. But there's no enforcement mechanism, and she was just flagging that there's a real problem, right, in that gap. I will say, just I was recently reminded of this because I belong to sort of a reading group of that includes some judges, and to their great credit, like I was going to take them out to dinner because we were having a kind of celebration, and they said we really can't do that, right? Because you would be paying for it, and we would have to report it. And I was really startled by that, and I thought, like, if I'm cooking dinner for 12 people because we can't go out to a restaurant, then I would really hope that the Supreme Court justices are also obeying some kind of ethics rule because what they're doing is far in excess of anything that my sort of paltry contribution would do. So that's thought number one. Thought number two is a little bit more controversial. I worry about court expansion, even though that's a constitutionally easier path. Because of just the gamesmanship, the very kind of obvious point of if we up the number of justices to 13 under one administration, then the next administration would up it to 17. And then sooner or later, you get to the Harry Potter whiz gamut with 50 judges and no end in sight, right? So I worry about that as a solution in that I think that there could be gaming on both sides. I think the more permanent solution is the one that seems more constitutionally troubling, but as usual, Wilfred is ahead of this, but I just want to spell out what I heard him to say, where if you just had like 18-year term limits for the justices, I think that would be terrific because neither side could game that. It would be seen as completely neutral, right, with regard to just, wanting the justices to roll off after a certain point in time. Back in the day, the framers had like natural longevity as their restraint. People just didn't live that long, or at least as long as they do now. But now with the 100-year life being the norm, right, for people who are born, right, in the last decade or so, we really have to rethink that, right? So having these 18-year terms seems like a really great idea. It would allow for more democratic conversation because you would know if you staggered the terms that every time you were voting for a president, you were voting for 2 justices per term. And so it would lend a kind of regularity to the process that wouldn't be like, oh, does this judge have a good nutritionist or are they playing tennis or what have you, right? As being the metric of when we could expect a retirement, and it would not allow justices to wait until a president of their own party was in power and to game it in that way as well. Of course, the elephant in the room on that is the constitutional restriction in Article 3 that says that the Article 3 judges get to serve during good behavior, which has been interpreted to mean life tenure. But that, to me, my mind, just means life tenure on a federal court. It does not mean life tenure on the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court justices could be told, you serve for 18 years on the Supreme Court, then of course you're more than welcome to serve on a lower federal court. And you can do by mandate what Justice Souter did of volition to say, after I retire from the United States Supreme Court, I'm going to go back down and serve on the First Circuit, right? But, you're still an Article 3 judge. It's just that you don't have life tenure on the Supreme Court. And I think that the constitutional provision can be plausibly read in that way.
And just quickly to add to that, I just want to say what Kenji's saying about the statutory approach to sort of imposing term limits or rotation or something like that. You know what I say? Like, there's debatable points on that issue on both sides, whether you need to go the statutory approach or the constitutional amendment approach. Well, just try it. Put the Supreme Court in the awkward position of, invalidating a statute about regulating its own jurisdiction, its own power, the scope of its own power. Let's do that instead of, just sending letters to the court to sort of explain what's going on and having John Roberts send one back saying separation of powers, mic drop, we're not coming before you. That's what I'd like to see.
And I'll just add, so I am one of those who thinks that the 18-year term limit Kenji mentioned is emphatically constitutional. Just try it means you have constitutional permission, I think. I just want to make one additional point, which is all of these things are things that Congress can and should do. And that brings up another point, since, as you mentioned, we're in the voting season right now. One of the things that we can do is elect members of Congress who actually take the Supreme Court seriously. So that's not just the Senate. The House has a role in every bit of this legislation that we just mentioned, the potential legislation. There are drafts out there. You need members to actually put them forward. And the Senate has an even bigger role because, in addition to all of that legislation, it's their role in the confirmation process that in part has us where we are. So people have to recognize, I think, that when they go to the polls, they're not just voting on a presidential race, which happens to be big and shiny. They're voting on a lot of other things, on state legislative races, which matter a lot, on congressional races, which matter a lot, on Senate races, which matter a lot. Every single one of those things matters, and they help with returning the Supreme Court to its rightful place in our federal structure, I think, because that's the way that we make it plain that we would like to put them back where they used to belong.
I would like us to close by thinking about that last bit a little more. Like, what is the role of the court in our federal structure? Like, what is it that we want to see the courts doing, especially since we've spoken a bit about all the ways the justices are falling short and misbehaving. But in our ideal world, what do we think courts should be doing? How should the justices be behaving? So we can basically, I'm trying to see if we can think about where it is we want to be so we can figure out how to get there.
So I think some of the things, I'll start and then I'll leave the others with the last word. Some of the things that I think we've seen from the court, others have mentioned, involve the court arrogating a lot of power to itself, right? Taking on the power to make lots of very big YOLO decisions very quickly, very emphatically. And one of the things I'd like best for the court is to recognize that's a power they have, but don't have to use. The court in its early years was most of the time, with some pretty big exceptions, pretty deferential to the elected branches. And it did decide when things were out of bounds, although very, very rarely up until the Civil War. Mostly it interpreted statutes. Mostly it dealt with its jurisdiction in other ways other than big judicial review controversies. I'd like to see the court remember some humility. I don't know whether it's possible with the current configuration, but in allowing the elected branches of government latitude, even if what they've done isn't the perfect solution, to recognize that there's a band of emphatically constitutional behavior that lives in between, and returning some discretion, I think, to branches that the court has decided to take discretion away from in what I think is actually an unconstitutional power grab of its own.
That's great. Wilfred, do you want to go or do you want me?
I'm whatever you like. You can go first, Kenji.
Great. So I would say, again, co-sign everything that Justin just said. I always think about this as like, what is needed for the court to become or remain or, be respected as a form of principle, right? And I always think that there are three components. You need a credible body of individuals who are interpreting a credible body of law, right, who are actually issuing credible, reasoned opinions. And I think all three components are necessary. And I think we've hit on them in one way or another in this discussion. With regard to the credible body of people, I think that we should expect the highest ethical standards, right, from our justices, and to the extent that they're either being put, on the court through anti-democratic processes, as my wonderful colleagues have posited, or if they're comporting themselves in ways that are eyebrow-raising for the general citizenry with regard to ethics, that's a huge problem with regard to legitimacy. So holding them to those high standards through ethics reforms. The credible body of law we haven't talked that much about, but these statutes and the Constitution that they're interpreting, the tricky thing about the Constitution is that it's so open-ended. And, Wilfred has written this wonderful book, The People's Constitution, about how it's not just a single, slice of time, it's a stream of time to which the Constitution has been amended. But many of those provisions are things like equal protection or the First Amendment, free speech or free exercise principles or due process of law. And these terms are not self-defining, right? And so even if we agree that this is a credible body of law, there are a couple of impediments. One is, and Madiba, you've written about this, one is that the terms are not self-defining. So let's stop pretending that they are. Let's be very transparent about the fact that there's a lot of interpretation going on. And the other one is, despite having learned so much from your book, Wilfred, I'm still left with this notion of, I would much more cheerfully be an originalist, frankly, if the Constitution weren't so darn hard to amend. So Article 5 is a huge impediment to allowing for a living Constitution. If we had a Constitution that we could amend and update in every generation, that would be one thing vis-a-vis originalism. But if you have a Constitution that's only been amended 27 times, and the bulk of it, right, of those amendments, or rather the bulk of the Constitution is really a 1789/1791 project, then originalism is always going to be bombing us back to a much earlier period in this nation's history. And Madiba, you've written eloquently about the dangers of originalism and the trap of originalism, and basically saying it sounds so principled, but if the only way to actually amend the law is through our incredibly cumbersome Article 5 procedures with regard to the Constitution, then originalism is just an invitation to bomb us back into the 18th century, which is not something that I personally, am willing to do. And then finally, the credible reasoned opinions, I think we've done a good job on here, right? Which is to say, when the court issues opinions, it needs to give us those closely reasoned opinions. And that becomes ever more important the more polarized we become as a nation. Because it's one thing for me to say I vehemently disagree with the conservative supermajority in the court, but then to be given reasons for why I lost. Vis-a-vis saying, a la the shadow docket, right? We're not even going to tell you why. So just live with this particular result. That just feels so much more like politics and not like the rule of law. So it's really those three things that I think are necessary. First of all, a credible body of people interpreting a credible body of law through credible reasoned decisions. And once we have that, then I think we'll be back on track, but we're a goodly distance away and we have some work to do.
I guess I'll just end by saying a couple of basic things, I think. One is the ethics stuff. Again, I mentioned like the yachts and trips and stuff like that. Let's not take it to the level where we're getting on a spaceship, of billionaires. So I will take for granted that like the plutocracy, I don't want to really see that in the driver's seat. So, judicial plutocracy aside, I guess judicial supremacy is really a problem for me, as you've picked up again. And I think, to echo what Justin said, that it's important that the court shows some restraint and shows some modesty in the scope of its decision making, and that includes which cases it's going to take. And so I think This is really what's been lacking, right? And just to think about two big cases that happened recently, United States versus Trump, the question about presidential immunity, and Trump versus Anderson, whether Trump was going to be on the ballot in the, Colorado and other states that wanted to remove him for having aided and supported attempts at insurrection. The Supreme Court took these important cases, and you can understand why, because they are so important, and yet it starts doing things that it did not need to do. It was asked very straightforward questions that could have been answered narrowly and straightforwardly, and in a way that just dispensed with the case. And you heard all of this talk about this needs to be a case for the ages. Why? We are asking whether or not a state can exclude Donald Trump from the ballot, not whether Congress needs to be creating the law to enforce it and the courts can't, or the court's going to have oversights and anticipate and put some restraints on Congress in terms of the scope of what it can do. It's doing all these big things with so little. And so I guess this is a plea for asking for some humility, some restraint, some moderation. And I guess in terms of what to do actively, like, as an election law scholar, I'm sure Justin feels the same, and I guess Kenji may feel the same about this too. I can't help but to be inspired by John Hart Ely to some extent, and so it's important for me for the court to be acting in a part where it reinforces representation, right? It bolsters the ability to participate in our elections. It thinks about ideas like a democracy principle where we err on the side of inclusion. It thinks about ideas of equality and inclusion and participation and transparency and competition, and these things that make our elections meaningful and matter and make the officials who they elect actually accountable and representative. And those aren't sort of like groundbreaking ideas. I think just if the court sort of takes that in a little bit with this idea of acting with some restraint, and on the other hand, Congress, put some teeth in its actions and actually challenges the courts in some legitimate ways to instill legitimacy back in the court, then we will be in a better position where we are not sort of ringing these alarm bells.
These have been great responses. And I think that's so right about the way that the court should be interpreting what it does, like not just being so narrow, but thinking about expanding democracy. And a lot of what we kept coming back today are things that Congress and the legislature can or should do. And so with that, I want to note that means it's not just a job for Congress, it's a job for you, viewers and folks listening, to get out there and vote, or if you can't vote, get out there and agitate. The ballot box is not the only way to make your points. And yeah, we're just thrilled to have folks participating in the democratic process. Thank you all so much for this conversation. I know we can keep going. When you have a bunch of law professors in a room, we just gab. But we only have so much time. And I want to thank you so much for this great conversation.
Here's the weird thing about this. No commercials. Your answers can be paragraphs.
It is the combination of social media and handheld devices. This is an industry that is entirely unregulated.
We are a wealthy society that has the most inequality of all the Western democracies. That is a choice.
Could you be friends with a Republican who voted for and still supports Donald Trump? It's complicated, but yes.
We're going back to the Capitol so the world sees us victorious.
They believed inside that the Vice President of the United States was going to be murdered that day.
We know that authoritarians can't succeed alone. They have to have enablers, and history will judge those people.
My favorite thing to call myself these days is conservative, because I want to conserve the land, the air, the water, the climate system, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act.
All right. So my name is Brandon Tensley, and I'm the national politics reporter at Capital B, a Black-focused nonprofit newsroom. And I'm really excited to be able to moderate this panel today. And we're looking at the future of voting rights. This sort of topic that is particularly consequential, I would say right now, given that, in another big election year, voter access and election security remain key concerns, not only for election officials, but for voters. A big chunk of what we'll talk about in this panel is this question of, from the ballot box to voter registration and redistricting and gerrymandering, what are some of the obstacles to getting to the polls? In addition to that, we'll look at what we can do to protect access to the franchise across the country. And so without further ado, I am very thrilled to bring up our two panelists. We have Deborah Cleaver, who is the founder and chief executive officer of Vote America, which is not simply a voter outreach organization, but also a voter turnout organization. And we are also joined by Daria Dawson, who is the executive director of America Votes, an organization that focuses on voter mobilization as a means toward creating a fairer and more representative democracy. And so without further ado, I would love to jump into some questions. And I'd love for each of you to answer this first one. You can fight over who goes first, or I can pick. But I think that with each of you answering, we can get a range of rich answers. And so over the past year, we've seen the U.S. Supreme Court deliver several major voting rights decisions, including two that involve voting maps in Alabama and South Carolina, my home state. We've seen a lower court issue an opinion preventing voters in about 7 states from enforcing their federal rights against discrimination under the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And we've seen Republican legislators in states such as Arizona push these rigid proof of citizenship laws. And so that's just really a taste of some of what we've seen just in recent months. And so I would like to hear from both of you. What are key ways that the voting rights landscape has changed, in recent months or even over the past year?
Oh, well, I think you actually covered so many of the ways that the voting rights landscape has changed. It's turned into what feels like an outright battle in the courts. In the first quarter of 2021, over 400 voter suppression bills were introduced in the states. And so since then, there's just been this mad scramble on both sides of the aisle to push legislation forward or to block the other side legislation. I would say that we're seeing the sort of battles that most of us in this space had assumed were behind us because of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act has led to unexpected and negative consequences. It'd be hard to overstate how damaging it is to not be able to sue under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. At the same time, we do see states that are pro-voting that keep making voting more accessible. So for every step back, I think there's also a step forward, and I'm really interested to hear what Daria thinks about this issue.
Well, Deborah, I appreciate that segue. And it's unfortunate, and it's so funny that you said on what did you say? Consequences that we didn't see happening with the gutting of the Holder case, Shelby v. Holder. We knew that was coming, right? Because in this time where we want to say we're in a post-racial era and we don't need to have an enforcement on civil rights on a federal level, we can call what it is, right? It's getting to the point of that protecting rights is becoming on a state-by-state basis. So where is that federal oversight to ensure that those who have been historically disenfranchised are protected, right? So I look at it as a way where we are getting into a very dangerous period of this country of a minority rule situation. where as people turn out to vote and, the popular vote, you could win in an office by 7 million, 8 million voters. But then there is still this like court system that's going to roll back. And that court system has been appointed by the most conservative people, the Federalist Society, where it is about how do we ensure that people who look like me, people who are women, people who choose to love people of their same sex, how do we ensure that their rights are still restricted? And that is by taking away voting rights. Imagine a country in which everyone who is eligible to vote was registered and utilized their fundamental right, their fundamental voice, and actually being involved in the voting process. What country could this look like if that were the case? What could this country look like?
And, I'm struck by this conversation about the different ways that we can sort of chip away people's right to vote. Deborah, I know that you work at the intersection of technology and democracy. And so I have a kind of two-pronged question for you. The first one is, how can technology be an asset to voting rights and as a result, democracy itself? And then I'm also curious about the flip side of that. How can technology be weaponized against, as Daria succinctly put it, the fundamental right to vote?
That is a great question. I'll take it in the order that you presented it. So first, I'll start by saying that technology isn't a solution, it's an amplifier. No one's voting or not voting because a widget exists or doesn't exist. One roadblock that I've focused on for most of my career is informational barriers. It's harder to vote in the United States than any other nation with democratically elected leadership, and that's by design. And we've actually hinted at it in these conversations. We have 50 different sets of rules for participating in the same election. That is very complicated. So the way we use technology is to distribute accurate and trusted information at scale. And technology, going back to when I started, meant the internet. The internet was still new. Organizing, and now technology can mean digital ads, it can mean TikToks, it could mean messages that come directly to your phone, it could mean using like interesting and very large data sets to identify like abnormalities in complaints at the polls. Like that's something we've done in the past so that we can show using data that there are more issues voting in Georgia 6 than there should be given the population. So there's very interesting things you can do with technology if you look at it as a way to aggregate and distribute data. The flip side is, and we've seen a lot of it this year, people use technology to mislead people. A great example of this is Elon Musk created a website that looked like a voter registration website. He ran like a targeted campaign to target Democrats who thought they were registering to vote and they weren't. And the laws are behind that, like that sort of process. So even though Michigan is investigating, I don't anticipate that there will be consequences for him before the election. And as Daria has stated, we can't always trust the current judiciary to even do the right thing when something nefarious comes in front of them. And I think that this is a reason for voters to go to trusted places like America Votes, like Vote America, organizations that were unintentionally very similar names, as opposed to some of these organizations that come out of nowhere and text you and you've never heard of them and they take you to a website that looks okay, but like, have you heard of the website? So I remain really excited about what technology can do for us, and also cautious in that the laws haven't caught up to it, and not everyone who uses technology shares our goals of diversifying the electorate and increasing participation.
Yeah, and even what you just said about apps, it reminds me of from earlier this year, and I'm sure both of you remember this in terms of disinformation and technology as a form of being used to further disinformation. But when there were the images going around of Black voters in, Trump hats or talking to Trump that were, completely AI generated, but, created with the intention of confusing voters or sort of just confusing the playing field. And I remember also talking to some organizers um, who are basically trying to create, like apps, sort of if you see a piece of disinformation, is it possible can you log it in the app? Somebody can sort of investigate it, can look at it to see what needs to be done so that more people don't fall victim to it. But Daria, I have a two-pronged question for you as well, somewhat related to this. But your organization, America Votes, focuses a lot on voter mobilization. And so I'm wondering, the first part of this question is, since the top of the Democratic ticket changed, it feels like so long ago, but I guess what, a month and a half, a little over a month ago, has this also changed the work that your organization has to do, the efforts to energize voters, especially Democratic-leaning voters who would have been looking at the Democratic ticket, seizing on this euphoria. And I'm wondering, sort of a follow-up to that is, how do you harness this enthusiasm? I've heard a lot of people talking about, vibes are important. That's often how elections can be won. It's less about getting into, a PhD dissertation about what you want to do policy-wise, but it's about sort of broadcasting to people that you are the right person for this job. But I'm wondering how your organization is also looking at how to mobilize this enthusiasm and turn it into voter turnout.
I appreciate both of those questions. So to give you a little bit of context, America Votes is the coordinating hub of about 400 organizations across the country, particularly in 13 states where we have staff embedded in those states, 12, where we have staff embedded into those states. So our team there is basically setting a plan of how to win through direct voter contact tactics. So that is knocking on doors, that is doing direct mail pieces, that is doing phone calls, that is sending text messages, et cetera. So we started planning for the 2024 election in June of 2023. And our plans are always revitalize and refresh, revitalize and refresh. We set a goal of how many voters are in our universe. We set a goal of how many doors we need to knock to connect with those voters, how many mail pieces, how many phone calls, et cetera, et cetera. We do the work through our partners at the table, who we see as the trusted messengers within the communities, the community groups in the states like Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, PA, and also those national partners that you could imagine, like the labor unions, the choice groups, the environmental groups, the constituency groups that work in multiple states. We always knew what our plan was, which was knocking on 33 million doors and talking to a set of voters, people of color, women, and youth voters. That has been our plan since June of 2023. There was absolutely an enthusiasm gap when it came to those voters. That has now changed since June. Was it June?
July.
We're all losing time here. That has absolutely changed since July 21st. And I would say vibes are real. I think when you look at the top of the ticket now, there is this excitement of something newer, something fresher, something that can move us forward as opposed to moving us backwards. That is exciting to people. But to your point, the vibes have to turn into actual votes. The good thing is right now, no matter what the polls say, no one has actually voted. Mm-hmm. And you're looking at polls of likely voters. So if an organization of America Votes is targeting like 500,000 people to register to vote and bring them into the mobilization and persuasion universes, likely voters aren't going to count for those 500,000, right? So my point is it's going to be close. We have a very, this is evergreen, so like specific we're less than 2 months away. By the time this conversation happens, we'll still be less than 2 months away. But I would say the enthusiasm that we're seeing, how you turn that into votes, is people who want to volunteer, people who want to donate money, people who want to organize within their own communities. That is how enthusiasm turns into actual people going to cast their ballots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that mirrors what she's an organizer in North Carolina told me, where it's basically like plug and play. It's people are excited, they're enthusiastic about things, and it's how do you get people to participate in a way that makes sense for them. If somebody wants to donate money, great. But for some people who can't donate money, but you're involved in your, Divine Nine organization, cool. We have organizations that can help with that. So that sort of plug and play model sounds like it works on a national scale as well. And Daria, something you also said makes me recall talking to an organizer in Harrisburg. And she basically was like, she came up in the sort of Obama school of organizing, where it was very much about micro targeting different groups and doing that sort of face-to-face work. And so this is leading to a follow-up question for you. I'm just so excited about this. And she had talked about how she feels like there's a sort of uh, Democrats in particular have not really done well with organizing since those Obama years. And she was like, love or hate Obama. She was like, that was like one of the best campaign outfits in like a generation at least. Do you feel like, I would love to throw that question to you. Do you feel like maybe organizing has changed um, more, maybe over the past month, give us a shorter sort of timeline in terms of people understanding the importance of making that sort of direct face-to-face appeals to voters? I'm even thinking about all the Zoom calls, right? After Kamala Harris replaced Joe Biden at the top of the ticket, and how it was this sort of incredibly diverse effort and push to reach people where they are and to be intentional about the messengers you have.
Yeah, I appreciate that question also because at America Votes, we believe there is nothing that is better than a one-on-one contact. That is why we focus on door knocks and canvassing first. I think what has happened in recent years to the point about technology of using multiple tactics and all of the tactics to meet the voters of where they are. And you see a lot of that going into media. People want to do TV. People want to do more digital. Digital is the thing now, right? So it's like in 2022, there was about $900 million of paid media that was spent on both sides of the spectrum. I can't even imagine what that number is going to look like for this presidential cycle. And I think that has taken away from candidates, I'll just stick with candidates here, of doing the direct voter contact piece that you really have not seen probably since President Obama's organizing campaign or doing organizing work, as you mentioned. I say to that reason why it's even more important for organizations that fall under the America Votes umbrella to still do that particular type of work. The organizations that the Planned Parenthoods of the world, the League of Conservation Voters, the Black Male Initiative, the NAACP, I'm just naming like the ones that people would recognize, but there's so many more. Like I said, we have 400 partners across the country. Those are the groups that are trusted in the communities that have the capacity to do, when well-resourced, to do the direct voter contact work. So how do you make that connection of, let's just use a choice group, Planned Parenthood, for example, of like, right now, abortion is a political issue. I do not think the court saw that coming in 2022 when Dobbs came down. Abortion is now a state-by-state issue. You know what else used to be a state-by-state issue? Slavery. So like, what do we do to ensure, what does Planned Parenthood do to ensure that folks are educated onto how abortion affects them personally, either as a woman or someone who loves a woman, and make that connection to the candidate, right? That is what the advantage of being with, working with the independent expenditure groups. It really is about the issues that are near and dear to them that they focus on 24/7. And then tie in that particular issue as who is right, who is in a better position to protect or expand that issue when they are elected into office.
Absolutely. And Deborah, I want to also kick this back over to you. As Daria just said, we have less than 2 months until Election Day. I feel like there's so many areas somebody could be focusing on in terms of the work that needs to be done between now and then. I'm wondering, if you could sort of give us an overview of what are some of your priorities over the next, less than 2 months in terms of voter outreach, voter mobilization, voter turnout, but where are you going to be directing your energy?
Okay, so we have two programs that will answer your question cleanly, but I just want to point something out. In the rest of the world, 100 days is a standard election cycle, so it feels so short to Americans, but I think, I don't know, we'll wait for the academics post-election to discuss this. I think part of the enthusiasm is it is a shorter time period. Other elections are interminable, like a 2-year cycle. I mean, Daria, I'm with you. I start planning what we're going to do, 24 months in advance, but that is exhausting for average people. And they were exhausted going into that debate, the Biden-Trump debate, and definitely exhausted afterwards. So sorry, a little bit of a sidebar there. I wasn't going to talk about it. This is a normal election cycle every place else in the US. But now back to your actual question. So Daria was talking about trusted messengers. We've started focusing on trusted media types themselves because not all media is equally trusted by the people who receive it. We have two large-scale media programs this year. One is a campus media program that we've been running since 2018. Campuses actually own media channels, student newspapers, billboards, transit ads, kiosks, posters that are produced by the schools themselves. Students trust the campus media more than they trust social media. And so what we do is we buy as much advertising as we can get on a college campus, and we run informational campaigns, everything from the voter registration deadline to the fact that students have dual residency and they can decide which state to vote in. We have a project called countmore.us. And if you tell us where you go to school, where your parents live, we'll tell you where your vote counts more in the presidential election. We let students know if their student ID is acceptable at the polls. Really importantly, we let them know the date of the election. So we run this large scale campus program. This year, we'll be targeting 6.4 million students on 519 campuses. Which is an exciting program. In the past, it's produced anywhere from a 2 to 8 point boost turnout, depending on how long we run the program for, and if it's a presidential or off-cycle election. So that's one program that we're running. Really excited. The other one, okay, y'all, this is not going to be what you expect. We run this really large-scale billboard campaign, and we put up billboards that say there's going to be record high turnout this year. Just between all of us, we always say that people have FOMO. Like that's the vibes we're talking about. So we say there's going to be record high turnout, and we let them know the date of the election and when early voting is. And in terms of targeting, we only put billboards in places that have at least 3,000 people per square mile, because as population density increases, so do liberal or pro-democracy values. But voter turnout decreases as places become more population dense. So we look for people who are in dense areas who are more likely to be liberal, pro-democracy, use whatever term you want, but are less likely to vote. And the date of the election itself is key. In October 2016, there was a national survey asking people if they knew the date of the election, and 40% of Americans did not know the date of the election, and 40% of Americans did not vote. They are related because the date changes every year in the US. Like that's just an example of a way that you could suppress turnout by creating an information barrier. And two fun facts for you two: 80% of partisan mail does not include the date of the election. So we get all this mail, we get all this media, it doesn't tell you when to vote. And I watched all 4 nights of the DNC and no one said the date of the election. So we focus on these things that people just assume everyone knows, and it definitely increases turnout. So Daria and America Votes, they have the trusted messengers, so important. And then we have the trusted media channels. And together, now you're starting to see how we get hundreds of millions of people one day to vote. But, this year, I do think we're going to see record high turnout, definitely be higher turnout than we saw in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, now I have FOMO, but no, I remember a couple of weeks ago, I just moved to Virginia from DC, so Northern Virginia. And I was like, let me make sure that like I'm, registering by the deadline and all that sort of stuff. But last question for both of you. I think we have a little less than 10 minutes to wrap. But I think often when we talk about, the future of voting rights, it can be a very gloomy sort of picture. Understandably, we talked about the 2013 Shelby County v. Holder decision, but I'm wondering if each of you could maybe tell us, is there a bright spot to the voting rights landscape that you've noticed over the past year, the past few months? I think Deborah, you had said earlier, that we have some like pro-voting states, right? And so, that made me think about a place like Minnesota that was able to enact its state level voting rights act to make up for some of the gaps that we see in federal legislation. So for each of you, could you, give us something a little bit more hopeful to walk away with?
I'll start since Deborah started with the first question. What gives me hope is that democracy, progressivism has actually been winning since 2017, right? I feel like that gets lost when you're looking at enthusiasm, as we were talking about earlier. Like we are looking at ways when we have these trifectas in states like Minnesota and Michigan to actually expand voting rights. We are seeing people understand the assignment when you want to put a ballot initiative in Ohio in August to change the threshold for the abortion ballot initiative the very next month. And that was defeated, right? So I think people are paying attention to how people are trying to chip away at democracy and fascism, right? And that gives me hope that no matter how they try to change the rules, as long as there is opportunity to educate the masses on what it actually means, folks are paying attention. They're very aware. People are understanding that it's not just about the top of the ticket, the presidential. It is about all of the levels of ballot, including things like the school boards. Like people are running for offices and school boards because the extremism is just too much. The book banning, not reading folks like Stephen King and Toni Morrison. Like people are like, hold on, wait a minute, what's happening here? So that is what gives me hope that people are noticing that this is a bigger picture and that the role as an individual, as an American citizen, is what's going to change and protect this country and protect this country's democracy.
Absolutely. Deborah?
I have a short answer, and it's echoing that the progressive side of the issue is winning. Over 80% of Americans are registered to vote. That is true at like any point during the year, because going all the way back to the Motor Voter Act, we have automatic voter registration. We have same-day registration. We have online voter registration. We have 3 decades of compounding wins, which means that over 80% of people in this country are registered to vote, which is a sure indication that you do want to vote. And if we can just get registered voters, help registered voters cast ballots this year, that is a 20-point boost in turnout. So every day that gives me hope. Every day, I'm like, that's what it calls that is what happens when you win year after year, 3 decades in a row. I'm an optimist. I can't help it.
No, I love it. Well, thank you both, Deborah and Daria, for joining us for this conversation. I will probably be hitting up both of you as sources for future stories, your organizations. So be on the lookout for my name. But thank you both so much. Your insight, I think, really has elevated the way that we think about the future of voting rights. So thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's a great conversation.
Well, hello everyone. Super stoked to be with you guys this morning. Well, morning where I am in Texas. I'm Josh Martin, National Political Director of College Democrats of America and a senior at the University of Houston. So go Cougs, wish us luck. We got a football game tomorrow, so wish us luck. But today we're here to talk about the upcoming election. Really big election season, as you guys know. Really exciting, honestly. This is actually going to be my second presidential election where I'll be able to vote because I remember in 2020 I turned 18 right when on the first day of early voting. I'll never forget, my mom told me. to make sure I go and vote. So she literally checked me out of school my senior year, took me to the polls, and went and voted. So, and then now, being a senior in college for, I guess, my second opportunity to vote in a presidential election, it's just awesome. Before we kind of kick off, I guess I'll give both of you a chance to introduce yourself. We can start with Bailey. You can go first, and Sam, you can go next. So let's do it.
Yeah, thanks, Josh, for moderating this for us. My name is Bailey Hona. I am currently the Chief of Staff at Voters of Tomorrow. I also lead high school Democrats in the state of Connecticut, and I'm a high school senior. It was my 17th birthday 2 days ago, so unfortunately I will not be voting this year, but I'm super excited to be working with all of you and doing what I can on my end with Gen Z and all of the sort of outreach that I do on that side.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me and thanks Josh for moderating. My name is Sam Montano. I use she, they pronouns, and I am currently a state representative in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I represent a neighborhood in Boston. And my first election that I voted in was 2008 for Barack Obama. I actually got to participate in the primary process all through that. And now here we are all these years later.
Yeah, no, it's awesome just being able to kind of see the process. I mean, I've been thinking about it literally just these past 4 years, just kind of being involved and civically involved in everything. And it's been a crazy roller coaster ride, I guess you can kind of say. So, I mean, I know that for me, I'm really motivated this election season, just seeing the energy amongst my peers going on my own campus, seeing people within my community, seeing them how excited they are to participate in the upcoming election. So I just want to know what motivates the both of you to want to get involved and personally participate in the upcoming election, starting with Bailey, especially because since you're not old enough to vote yet. But so what's kind of making you want to get involved for this upcoming election season?
Yeah, I mean, although I am very much on the younger side of all of this, I have been involved for a good amount of time. I remember kind of campaigning and doing what I could for Hillary Clinton in 2016. I was 8, but I was really excited about the prospect of having a female president. So we're here now. A little bit of a different process this time, but I am so about the so excited about the prospect of having Kamala Harris as our president. Not just as a woman, but as a woman of color and also a champion for young people on literally every single policy. So I'm really, really excited about that, and excited about turning out Gen Z.
And Sam, what's motivating you for this upcoming election season?
You know, I am a member of like the non-binary community, and I think we've seen, and I've been lucky enough to be in coalition and in groups with other folks who are trans, non-binary, genderqueer, and their elected state representatives across the United States, and we're seeing the impacts of harmful, hateful legislation that's being filed in other places. And it's primarily from, the Republican Party. And so for me, it's very much a issue of survival. And for me, an issue of personal politics, right? Like I'm also Mexican, Chicana. I grew up in Los Angeles. My grandparents immigrated here from Mexico. I identify as queer. All right. I'm holding all these different spaces, and we get to see as politics impact how we live our lives and how we take up these spaces and what futures we're carving out for ourselves. And so for me, it's incredibly important that I participate in this next election, and that I talk to as many people as possible who are going to potentially participate in this election, and make sure that people are turning out and voting and putting their time into this, because it can, people think that it doesn't matter, right? And sometimes it can seem like that, and in certain states, right, it varies, but we really need everyone to show up, right?
I mean, you're completely right. And I mean, that's something that I go and tell people all the time. I mean, no matter what career field you're going to, or no matter what you're planning to do within your life, politics is going to impact you one way or another. Like I tell people, if you're a business owner and you want to open up a business one day, certain laws and regulations on whether that's zoning restrictions or whatever it may be, may dictate where you can and cannot open that business that you want to start up. So literally with any career path, politics has a very important role in your daily lives. So, I'm always telling people that's why it's so important to vote in those down ballot races, making sure that you're voting in every single race, not just for the president, because, it's your member of Congress, your state representative, your city council member. Those are the things that are going to impact your daily lives. So, Sam, I know you mentioned how LGBTQ plus issues are really passionate thing for you, but what issues do I think as a whole, like what are some other issues do you think are ultimately going to drive young people to the polls this election season? And why is it so important that those issues are focused on a national level?
I think it's going to be the small everyday things that impacts our lives, which, typically aren't conversations we have at the federal level. And I'm really excited to see Vice President Kamala Harris talking about housing. I think that that's a huge issue. And one of the things that keeps folks who are younger from being able to live where they want to live, participate where they want to participate, be able to save money to buy a house in the future, right? If they can't afford to live in the cities where there are jobs that they want to do, if they can't afford to pay their bills, if they can't afford to get out and put money into our economy, we're going to have a really different United States than I think anyone wants to participate in and wants to be able to live in. And so for me, it's exciting to see housing be a top issue that's pushing people out. I think wages are another issue. What are we looking at? How much are people getting paid? We still have a $7 minimum wage at the federal level, which is just like mind blowing. Like where are you living that you're getting paid like a $7 minimum wage, and how are you surviving? Right. And being able to address those like smaller they're not small factors, but those are like more intimate everyday factors that people care about and that people are focused on versus like the larger things like how are we reining in corporations, right? People don't really care about that on an everyday level, but those are part of the conversation. And those are ways that we also are able to get folks paid more, get more housing built, right? And I think that as a party, we've talked about those other things at a higher level, and that doesn't really encourage people to turn out. But talking about housing, talking about being a homeowner, talking about getting access to wages, talking about ways to help people, move through the world in a way that is comfortable for them. Those are huge issues, and I'm glad to see that the party is starting to focus on like those issues at the federal level.
Definitely. I mean, you're completely right about that because, issues like housing are very important, especially for young people, especially because, I mean, myself, I'm about to graduate college within this upcoming year, hopefully going to law school next year, but still, it's going to be a very, interesting time being able to buy a home potentially one day. I'm like, I know me and my friends talk about it sometimes. I'm just like, dang, like, literally in a few years, I'm going to have to like start adulting. And it's like, it's kind of weird. It feels really weird to me. And it's just like, these are things that we need to think about, though. And those are conversations that need to be had because, I mean, young people being able to buy a home, that's a very, uncommon thing right now. I had conversations with my uncle, and he always tells me that, I remember he told me that after he graduated college, buying a home is just something that you did. Coming right after college, you just bought a home and then got ready to start a family. And then I look at him like, buy a home? Like I'm only 21 right now, and I seem far away from being able to buy a home. But like how you said, I really like I think that being able to prioritize things like housing, building more affordable housing, that's one thing that we're going to be very ecstatic about to turn out about. So Bailey, what do you think is an issue that's going to drive out young voters this upcoming election cycle?
Yeah, something I'm hearing a lot more working on the national level and contacting and like meeting Gen Z where they're at with direct voter contact and all of that is the issue of abortion and reproductive rights. I mean, thinking back, something I keep saying and I keep hearing is that I'm growing up in a time where I have less rights than my grandma did when she was my age, and which is just incomprehensible and something that is like obviously very hard for like young women like me to, digest and internalize and all of that. But I mean, that's something I'm hearing from, the people on my team at Voters of Tomorrow that work on the ground that are, whether it's on the state level, on our chapter level, or even on the national, like I said, the issue of reproductive rights and being able to get access to just simply life-saving care is just insane and incomprehensible. And that's something that, in conversations with kids, even my age, that aren't able to vote yet, when I'm talking to just like my friends here at home that don't really know a lot about, what I do personally, when I'm having conversations with them and I'm like, I mean, I'm lucky enough to live in Connecticut that has all of these protections for reproductive rights, but that is not the case across the country at all, which is just, I mean, mind-blowing to me. So when I'm having conversations with normal 16 and 17-year-olds like myself, being able to say to them, like, do you realize that like things like condoms and things like Plan B are things that kids like us across the state don't necessarily have as easy of access to, which is just crazy. And then these kids that like have never really thought about voting in their life are like, oh my God, this is doable. We need to do something about this. This is crazy. So yeah, long-winded answer, but basically I think the issue of reproductive rights and abortion is, I mean, we saw it in 22. I think that's played a big part in, the way the midterms ended up. But I mean, I think that's still a continuing issue that will be there until something is done about it.
I mean, you're completely right. I mean, reproductive health is a very important issue. As someone in Texas with one of those Trump abortion bans that we're seeing right now, it's pretty crazy. I mean, in Texas, you literally have people like Kate Cox who are forced to flee our own state to go and get reproductive care, only to find out after the fact that she was actively being prosecuted by the lieutenant governor just because she went and needed a life-saving abortion. So, I mean, those are stories that you hear all the time in a state like Texas and numerous states. I know there was like a 13-year-old girl in Mississippi forced to carry a pregnancy to term. I mean, these are realities that we're seeing right now in our everyday lives. And it's like, I mean, what people don't realize is that, if we let Trump get back in office, this is something that we could see nationwide. I mean, it's not just a Texas thing. I mean, this is something that could potentially be a nationwide thing. I mean, you look at Project 2025, it's clear that they want to institute a national abortion ban. And you saw in the debate that Trump would not even commit to vetoing a national abortion ban. So, I mean, he's shown us who he is. And I think that we need to just make sure that we're getting out and telling as many people as possible. So, I mean, I know with that being said, with turnout and everything, it can be uncommon sometimes for young people to want to turn out. I mean, I was literally having a conversation with my friend literally just this morning, and he was just like, yeah, man, like, I don't really vote like that, man. But like, I mean, I just want to make sure that my family's taken care of. It doesn't really matter to me who's in office. So, and seeing someone like that, it's just like, dude, like, you don't understand that I mean, because I worked for Congresswoman Jackson Lee, rest in peace, my mentor. And she would always be like, your voice is your voice is your vote, and your vote is your voice. And I think it's very important that everyone, no matter who you vote for, well, you could be the most far right person, disagree with me on everything, but I still advocate for for them too, to make sure that they have their voices heard. So we'll start with Bailey. How would you respond to someone younger particularly, who says their vote doesn't matter or it won't make a difference? How do we break through to those people?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely difficult. And having these conversations with people, something I like to do is say to them, hey, what issues matter to you? And that's something that, like, right off the bat, they're thinking like, I don't care about taxes or whatever it be. But when you break it down to like a smaller level, even something like marijuana legalization is something that obviously our generation is passionate about in one way or another. So like when you're breaking it down to something like that and saying, okay, if you like the idea of marijuana legalization, vote for Democrats or vote for these champions of this policy that like people don't think elected officials have much of an effect on. And especially when it gets, I'll pass this on to Sam to talk more about down ballot. Because I think their perspective on this is obviously much more important than mine. But when we get down to like, my mom is a local elected official. She won her race by 4 votes. And that is something like, I live in a very small town, but that's something that it's hard to realize, especially it's less comprehensible for people our age to be like, hey, if 4 people didn't get out and vote, here's these policies that could have been implemented that would have affected your life more than you think they ever would, especially on something like, school board or what would it be?
And Sam, what do you think? What do you think? How do you think that we get out to those people? How do you think we turn them out?
I think it is hard because people are the more removed you are from the like everyday policies that are affecting you, the like less you realize the impact it's having on you, right? And so people are living their everyday lives focused on what they're focused on, right? They're not thinking about other people in their community. They're not thinking about like how this decision that they make is impacting like the greater community, right? So we have to make a change to encourage people to be more community based and to be like, my vote isn't just for me, right? My vote is for the kind of country that we want to live in. My vote is for the kind of community that I want to inhabit. My vote is for the kind of place that I want to see, right? And I think that those are, at least, in where I'm in a really high voter turnout district. I'm in a district that leans very left, is very engaged, is very plugged into policies, right? And so when I'm talking to folks in my district about voting, I'm like, there's all these things that I know you want to see, and so that means you need to turn out and vote. And I think we've seen, even in places like Massachusetts, right, the slow dismantling of our legislation and our laws. We had Romney Care, right, which is the universal health care in Massachusetts. And we watched as like our previous Republican governor, Charlie Baker, like slowly dismantled access to that universal health care option, right? And that happened because less than half of the state turns out to vote, and turns out to vote for Democrats versus Republicans. So those are things that you like don't notice that are happening, and that the everyday person isn't like plugged in watching every like strike of the pen that an elected official makes, or that a governor makes, or that a president makes, right? But we do make those decisions at the ballot box to show up and say, like, this is the kind of direction I want our country to go in. This is the kind of direction I don't want our country to go in. And because we're so disengaged, we often get folks who are not representative of the policies we want to see at the greater level. Like, polling shows us one thing, right? But we don't ever see that get put into who we elect. And so when I'm having these conversations, I'm saying, like, your lack of engagement is part of the reason why we're struggling, to get the things that we all want to see, and the things that we know are popular, and the things that we know will help the greatest amount of people. And so maybe it's a little bit of guilt, and maybe it's like a little bit of like, what is the vision you want to see, and how do we get this community spirit, and how do you like appeal to people's greater sense of responsibility to their neighbors? How do you appeal to people's greater sense of responsibility to their community? But yeah, I also agree with what Bailey said too. Like, what do you want to see? What do you care about? Let me tell you how it's impacted by your lack of turnout, right? And here's how you should turn out to vote. And now there's so many options for people to vote. You can go early, you can mail in, you can go the day of. Like, there's so many ways to do it, and we're watching those ways get peeled back too, right? So it's it's a lot of work to get people to vote, and I'm not sure that there's one particular way, but a little bit of guilt tripping, a little bit of tagging into their sense of responsibility, a little bit of like self-interest, trying to figure out what they want.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with you 100%. And it's a lot of people like that. And it's just about getting out to those people, like how Bailey said, finding out what people particularly care about, the issues that matter to them. I know, like, for a lot of people I've talked to, affordability, being able to buy a home, a lot of people care about climate change. A lot of people care about reproductive health. I mean, these are lots of important issues that people genuinely care about. So, but I know there's also, you have one side of it where you have some people that, they just don't really want to get involved, but you have another side of people that say that sometimes that, hey, this candidate may not 100% reflect my views or my values, and sometimes they feel like they're choosing between the lesser of two evils or something like that. So I guess what my question is, and we'll start with Sam, how do you think that campaigns and groups can communicate with those people who may say that, I'm kind of on the fence between one person or another? Like, how do you think we turn out those people? Because sometimes we see it to where those people that say, oh, well, this person may not believe in this certain policy, so I'm just not going to vote at all. So how do you think we go and get to those people and communicate to make sure that those people feel heard and represented?
I think it's organizing on the ground, right? And getting people to continue to turn up, because do you know who is turning up? People who is having conversations with you. Lobbyists are talking to your candidate, right? People who donate high amounts of money are talking to your candidate, right? And they're going to have maybe that's probably going to have a very different perspective than like a younger voter, right? And so it's about showing up. It's about organizing. It's about making sure that your voice is heard, right? And it's about talking to people across the United States and pushing that dialogue and pushing that conversation, because if you're not showing up and you're disengaged and you're not talking, there are other people who are, and then you're getting a really skewed perspective of what the candidate, the president, whoever it is getting a really skewed perspective of like what the country needs. And so it is essential that you go talk to them. It is essential that you write letters. It is essential that you organize and build bases, and that you don't get discouraged if you've had a setback, because organizing is a slow, long, task. I've seen candidates evolve over 10 years, be like totally against something, and then 10 years later be on the like the right side of an issue, right? Whatever, on the different side of the issue, right? And that's because people put in 10 years of work to get them over there. And so it's understanding also that a lot of folks are older, and because they're older, they've seen change happen, and so they're more hesitant to make drastic change. They're more hesitant to like talk up to move without what they think is a broader consensus. And it's also realizing that I think folks are impatient and they want things to happen fast and they want things to happen quickly, and that's unfortunately not what happens in politics. It's a very slow game. And so I would say like just get on the ground, organize, talk to other people, and make sure that you are showing up, because if you are not sharing, then that's a voice that's missing. And there are definitely other people who are more powerful, more connected, who are sharing and who are probably driving the conversation in a way that maybe you don't like or you don't agree with.
I mean, that's right. And Bailey, how do you think we reach out to those people?
Echoing everything Sam said 1,000,000%, something that we found really effective is relationally organizing, exactly what Sam said. So, even what I was talking back on the repro question, having conversations with my peers about how I feel and how I'm going to vote and how that's affecting me is such a stronger message than having someone older or a candidate or someone that you just don't trust talking down to you saying, vote, 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 for this different reasons. And like, it sometimes is incomprehensible. And I say this all the time that young people are the best messengers for young people. So meeting them where they're at, whether that's, having relational conversations with your friends, or it's hiring young people to work on your campaigns and do your digital, so that young people are reaching out to young people and being more effective messengers. And because, Gen Z knows Gen Z, I always, have a really good feeling when I'm scrolling and seeing a candidate's post, and I can tell if that's like, I was like, that was made by an intern and that's great. Or that was made by a 4-year-old comms director that, is probably great at their job, but I feel like this is just being used to get my vote. So yeah, use young people in not using young people, but using young people to your advantage, and meeting them where they're at and having relational conversations with the people you care about, and people that trust you, and vice versa.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely retweet on the social media aspect, because as someone who's done like some social media work on campaigns and for an elected official, you can definitely tell whenever it's an older person or whether it's a younger person who's running the social media. You can definitely tell. And I don't even know how to really explain it, but like you can just tell. So, but I know we touched on this earlier, about how important it is to talk about down ballot races, because down ballot races are really what's going to be honestly shaping your everyday life. Because like how I said earlier, your local school board member or your city council member or your local state representative, those are the kind of people that can have a direct impact on your daily life. They're more accessible. So, we'll start with Bailey, and I know Sam's gonna have a lot probably to say about this, but how do you think, how important do you think that it is that young people particularly vote in down ballot races, and why is it so important to them?
Yeah, it is crucial. And I know I touched on this before, but in 2021, I was 13, I was bored, and my mom's like, I'm running for city council. My mom's also a union organizer, so it's kind of always been there, all of that politics and all of that. So she said to me, I'm gonna run for city council. This is like a town of not a lot of people and also not a lot of voters. How are we gonna make this work, and how are we gonna turn people out? And I got to play a really cool big role in that, and getting to, learn a lot of that just through working on it, like a very small race. But like I said, she won by 4 votes in a very red town as a Democrat, that was because we were there advocating on behalf of the issues rather than the party. And that's something that is obviously very niche to where you live, and the amount of voters that you're reaching out to. But it was just like, it's crazy to me that like, if maybe they were even 4 Gen Zers didn't get out to vote that day, that that race would have gone completely differently. And so what? She won. But what it comes down to is the fact that she's been able to advocate for policy. We just got, or early voting passed in the state of Connecticut literally last year, which is crazy to think about, like such a blue state that is getting to do early voting for the first time in the primaries a couple weeks ago. So she's got to play a really big role in advocating for the most accessible polling locations. That is something that the Republican majority would not have done if it weren't for Democrats in the room.
And Sam, why do you think it's important that young people particularly vote in these down ballot races?
I think something that I think about a lot, because we just had our primary in Mass. So I got elected with it was like low. It was like 5,000 votes or something. And I represent 44,000 people. And I'm in a high turnout district. I had like the second highest turnout in Boston, in my district, right? And so there's 160 reps in the state house. We have people getting elected with 1,200 votes. And maybe they're in leadership and they're really dictating a path of the Commonwealth. And maybe they are in a town that's smaller and not necessarily representative of the bigger cities or like things that you want to see done. And it's because people think that, doing federal elections is more fun and like the presidential election is like the one they have to vote for. But it's really like these in between races every year, like the city council races, the state rep races, the state senate races, right? Those municipal races that are important and are impacting your everyday life in a way that the federal government is just a slower ship to turn. Like this federal government is so slow, and the state and municipal governments can move much more quickly, can respond and fix your everyday life problems much more quickly. And because people are engaged in those races, we're seeing like things happen in states like abortion bans that aren't popular, and then they have to go to the ballot, right? Like, and so it is essential that you plug into your local stuff, and it is a lot more work for the voter, right? We're putting a lot more, like, there's the candidates and the elected should be putting in way more work, meeting you more than halfway, but the public also has to plug in a little bit too. And we've seen that be difficult because of the way that local journalism has shrunk, and we can't get information out in the same way. Not everyone is on social media, not everyone is reading the paper, right? Like, so we haven't quite figured out a way to like communicate these things and make it easier for people to vote. I think if we make it easier, if we get people to turn out in more than 12% on election day, we're going to be looking at a very different country and in a much more responsive country. And I think that that's what will help the future generations who are coming up in a way that that is more impactful than like every 4 years at the federal level, right? Like,
no, I mean, you're exactly right there. I mean, because like how you said, I mean, those races are the ones that can impact your daily lives in a quicker and more efficient process. I mean, so it's really important that people get out and vote in those down ballot races, because some people just want to go and push the button at the top of the ticket and then just get out and go home. It's like, no, you got to go all the way down to the bottom, because I mean, like how Bailey said, I mean, some of the times those races are decided by just a few votes. I mean, I literally in the state Senate district that I live in, it was really decided by like 100 votes or less in like the runoff election. And it's really important that people get out in those things. So I think it's almost time that we're going to wrap up, but we'll probably go with closing thoughts. If you guys just have anything else that you guys will want to say to young people or just anyone in particular about this upcoming election, what would it be, Sam?
I would say, like, when you talk to older folks, particularly older folks of color, older women, like older Black folks, they cherish the right to vote, right? Because of how hard they fought to access it, to get it. And I've never met like an older person, whether they're Latino or Black, who doesn't make it their priority to show up and vote and doesn't make it their priority to come, or who's become a citizen, right? And I want that same urgency and that same dedication to voting across the board for everyone. I think it's essential for the future that we want to see. And I understand the frustrations that people have and the way that they feel like candidates aren't, everything and everything to anyone. Particularly at the presidential level, it's difficult, right? Because you're representing a whole country of over 300 million people. But I would say, like, the urgency is there. We're in a pretty dire situation, I think, with the two candidates we have. And a lot of people have fought for a very long time to get the voting rights that we have, and have been through a lot. And so I think that we need to respect that, and to show up and vote, and make sure that your voice is heard, because no matter how much access to power or money you have, what you do have is the ability to vote. And so use it.
You're exactly right. I mean, coming from, a household raised by a Black mother, she always told me, she's like, we got people that lived and died to have the right to vote. So she'll be like, I know for a fact that my son's gonna get out there and go and vote. So and that's just something that's just been instilled for me from a young age. I mean, every time she went to vote, from when I was 5 years old, I remember her dragging me into the voting center, and they would give me a little "I voted" sticker, and I would wear it to class. So I've been like, it's just something that's been honestly instilled in me my entire life. And so Bailey, if you had one thing to say to really anyone in general about this upcoming election and the importance of it, what would it be?
Yeah, in the same vein as both of you, I think we've heard for the past, I don't know, a couple cycles at this point that this is the most important election. And I hate to say it, I hate hearing it, but that's really where we're at. And it sucks, but it's the reality that democracy is at stake, reproductive rights are at stake, and just rights in general, which is disgusting and incomprehensible, but that's where we're at. And we really do have an opportunity to steer us in the right direction and fix all of this. And the only way to do that is by getting out and voting. And whether, on my end, where I'm not necessarily will be walking into the polls on November 5th. I'm having relational conversations with people that I care about. I'm sitting there on phone banks. I'm getting involved for the issues that I care about. I'm within my work with Voters of Tomorrow, working on the national level, partnering, whether it be with the Harris campaign or the Democratic Party at the top, and then on locally helping out my mom and then my state rep with our local races here. Across the board, it's really important that you not only walk into those polls and vote on November 5th, even if it's not your favorite people on the ballot, it's still so important. But also that you continue the advocacy, whether no matter who ends up in January or December, whenever you guys switch over, that you continue that advocacy and continue fighting for the issues and the candidates that you care about.
I mean, always. I mean, 100%. I mean, another thing, to quote my mentor, Congresswoman Jackson, the marathon always continues. So it's always going to keep going, no matter what happens. We always just got to keep going. So like how you said, getting on those phone banks, knocking on doors, doing whatever you can do. Whether, I always tell people, whether you're in the barber shop getting a haircut, whether you are in the sandwich shop getting a sandwich, talk about it. Talk to them. I always make it my mission every time I'm in an Uber. I always talk to my Uber driver about and I flip so many Uber drivers at this point into turning them into voters that that's honestly probably one of my biggest accomplishments. So thank you both for coming on this panel. It was amazing talking with you both for the time that we had. I'm really thankful for the both of you for the work that you're doing across the country, making sure that we can protect our freedoms and our rights, because all those things are on the ballot. So thank you guys so much for having me as a moderator, and thank you guys for joining me. And let's continue to do the work.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks to joining us on this conversation about journalism and democracy. I'm Mona Charon, syndicated columnist and policy editor at The Bulwark, and I am joined by two distinguished colleagues who will introduce themselves. So, Siva, why don't you tell us a couple things about you?
Sure. I'm Siva Vaidyanathan. I'm a professor of media studies at the University of Virginia, and I'm a journalist in recovery.
Okay, and Jeff Jarvis.
I'm Jeff Jarvis. I'm the Tao Professor of Journalism Innovation Emeritus at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY, and I have a book coming out next month called The Web We Weave.
All right. So I'd like to begin by addressing what I think is the greatest challenge facing journalism right now vis-a-vis our democracy, and that is trust. There are any number of surveys that show that people have very low levels of trust in media, And when you combine that with the proliferation of alternate sources, you have a recipe for the explosion of conspiracy theories and the difficulty in a democracy of having one conversation that's based on one set of facts. So, Siva, if you wouldn't mind taking a crack at that one.
I think we've seen an erosion in public trust in a number of institutions over about 60 years. So you could track any of the institutions that used to be held in high regard and have sort of deep roots in the American consciousness from the 1950s and 60s. And you can see those erosions of trust starting in the 1970s. There are a handful of exceptions, but for the most part, this country has become more atomistic, a lot less trusting, a lot less convinced that our neighbors are share the same interests and the same future, and so we see that, of course, through any sort of measure of trust in professionalization. So our media institutions are highly professionalized these days. They weren't always. That's a post-World War II phenomenon. The very fact that they went through the process of establishing all of the markers of professionalization have now led them to the point of being deeply suspicious in many people's minds. So that trust has to be earned anyway, right? It's not granted by virtue of titles, degrees, wealth, or power. And so one of the ongoing conversations that Jeff has been involved in, and I've been involved in for a number of decades now, has been to what extent must these institutions and the practitioners of journalism itself be convinced they must constantly deserve the level of trust that is necessary for us to, as citizens, rely on the information we are getting to behave and act as responsible citizens.
So, Jeff, I want to tease apart something that Siva just said, because he spoke about the professionalization of media since World War II. And I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you meant is that the people who inhabit sort of mainstream media and even others have become mostly college educated, or they have advanced degrees, and they tend to be coastal elites, et cetera, and that this has put distance between them and some people in the other parts of the country who don't feel represented and think there's liberal bias and so forth. But then there's another side of professionalization, which is when the media imposes standards on itself. Professional organizations, the American Society of Newspaper Editors, or various groups that try to impose standards exactly to make journalism more trustworthy and reliable. So, Jeff, do you have thoughts on those distinctions?
I think, to use Siva's timeline, which I think is right, the idea that we ever had a single conversation based on single facts, as you said, Mona, I think was a myth of mass media and a myth since the advent of television in the 50s. And the natural state of media was not that we had one body to tell us, as Walter Cronkite said, and that's the way it is, when to many Americans it wasn't the way it was. When if you were Black, Latino, immigrant, LGBTQ, disabled, and others, you heard a different reality than the one you were living. And the idea that we had something called mainstream media is itself a misnomer. On my shelf, I have a book of the newspapers in America in 1900, and it is quite thick. And in New York, there were a few score daily newspapers. And we look upon that now as if that's some kind of fragmentation and atomization. Instead, I think it's a more natural state of things in which people had voices that spoke for them that were in dialogue with other voices. Before the mechanization and industrialization of print, which I think is the real beginnings of mass in the mid-1800s, the average circulation of a daily newspaper in the US was 4,000. It was a good Substack newsletter. And so I think the internet brings us back to that to some extent. So there is a lack of trust, I would say, in mainstream media. But right now, to go to Siva's point as well, they have to earn that trust, and they often say they want to get that trust back. I'm not sure they ever had it, first off. And secondly, they're certainly not earning it now. I've just written 2 posts in the last few days bemoaning what I see happening at our most august institutions of journalism, at the New York Times and the Washington Post, as well as CNN, as well as others. I'm seeing an anger at them, not from the right. The right has long not trusted them, and the right wants to destroy them, but from the left that is extremely disappointed in them and how they are operating these days. So there is indeed a huge crisis of trust in this professionalized media, because I think that professionalization in the end created a distance. In fact, we as journalists like to say that we're separate from the people, almost above the people, and the people now have the opportunity to tell us how much they resent that.
Well, I think there's something more interesting going on than the decline of trust. Decline of trust is something that I think actually journalists are pretty comfortable talking about, because they can refer to their practices, their codes, their the ways in which they do actually serve the public interest with great frequency under most conditions. What's really been happening over the past, let's say 20 years, but we could go back another 20 and say 40 years, has been a radical change in our entire information and media ecosystem. So think about the fact that, so Jeff mentioned the mid-19th century as newspapers proliferate through the United States, with a country that was barely literate, and yet all of a sudden teeming with news and information in very fractured, very partisan forms, right? In fact, most newspapers, I think in most cities in America, were controlled by their local political parties. So
and they had names to go with them.
Exactly.
The Democrat or the
Arkansas Democrat Gazette is a legacy of it, right? So, but that the mid-19th century was a time of quiet and darkness relative to today, right? Not very few people had electricity. There were not devices that would make noise beyond the noise that animals and the wind made, right? So the world was quieter and darker. As you go through the 20th century, the world becomes steadily louder, steadily brighter. We get brighter devices in our lives. They distract us more. There's a sense of fighting for attention as everything shifts by the last decade of the 20th century to a race for attention. And then all of a sudden we get new outlets that exponentially multiply the content trying to grab our attention, whether that's gambling or pornography or news or video, right? All of a sudden it's just so much harder to actually grab someone's attention, and so much harder for individuals to focus on anything. And so, of course, consciousness and collective consciousness is fractured with those changes. So we have a real environmental change going on that all of our challenge now in the 21st century is to figure out how to run a democratic republic with such an attention fractured, chaotic, I would say cacophonous environment, right? It's really hard to focus on anything, and it's really hard for the responsible, essential conversations about important issues to gather and hold that attention long enough. And given that the commercial nature of so much of our media, it's actually not in their interest to gather and sustain attention. It's more often in their interest just to keep gathering and not take someone on a deliberative path toward real understanding. And this happens at the very moment when our entire planet faces deep problems that require deep thought. And we're just not equipped to do it right now.
Right. And if you enter into this cacophony, the AI and all of the accompanying disruptions that it promises, what's your evaluation of how well the press, journalism has handled technological changes so far? And how well do you think it will handle the next one, the one that's on our doorstep?
Thank you for that setup to plug my book, in which I examine the moral panics that media have engaged in, from the novel, which was seen to destroy women's morals through radio, movies, television, video games, and so on into the internet and next AI. And it's a succeeding moral panic. What's different about this one, the internet and AI, is that media themselves see themselves in competition with this media and want to fight it down and want to argue with it. And I think that they haven't done very well, and they haven't understood that essentially, I think what AI shows us is that we have reached the full commoditization of this idea of content. That content is a Gutenberg era notion. Manufacturing content is a losing business. Everybody can make content now. Content is not where value lies. Value lies, and this goes back to your question of trust, in serving people, in understanding them, in listening to them, in recognizing their needs, in understanding the circumstances of their lives, in listening to them. And that's a very different business from the business we think we're in. We think we're in the business of manufacturing content and getting people to not only read it, but buy it. And to Siva's point about attention, the attention marketplace I mark with the beginning of Frank Muncie's magazine in 1890 something, when he sold it at a loss because he'd make money on advertising. And so the more audience he had and the more attention he had, the more money he made. That same business model has come into the internet and, in my view, corrupted it. Now, I'm a capitalist, and I think we've got to support journalism and figure it out. But I think we haven't understood how to recheck on the value of journalism.
I think what you're both saying, and it's something I've given a lot of thought to as well, is that we are in the midst of this, civilizational challenge about how we receive information, and it's disrupting everything, and maybe especially journalism. And so I'd be curious to hear you both on the topic of how to perhaps begin to get a handle on it, because eventually I think the culture is going to figure it out. We're not going to be in this cacophony forever. But how would we move toward that? So, for example, when you listen to focus groups of voters, one thing that comes across time and again is people say, well, I don't really know what to believe. And people feel a bit at a loss. And then I was struck by a program that I read about in Finland, where they're teaching teenagers to be skeptical consumers about what they see online, how to recognize frauds, how to recognize scams, etc. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah. So first of all, teenagers aren't the problem nor the solution. The problem in this country and in most of the world are people over 50 who, we can't count on to make decent judgments about anything. But we can't get them in a classroom either. So and therefore the sense of addressing the problem is missed if we think that focusing on young people is the answer. I spend a good part of my week talking to 20-year-olds about these very issues. And granted, it's a strata of America that is eager to be educated and to achieve leadership positions. Those are the self-selected people who end up in my classroom. Nonetheless, there is a real critical sensibility already. I would actually argue that Americans have over-exercised their critical sensibilities to the point where they are willing to disbelieve and distrust almost everything. And therefore, a significant portion of the country is deciding not to vaccinate themselves or their children. And that is the bigger problem, is that we don't trust not just journalists. We don't trust scientists. We don't trust doctors. We don't trust the public health experts. We don't trust the government when the government is actually doing its job. And so again, it's a deeper problem, and it comes from this notion that no one does know who to trust. We've been told over and over and over again by messages both within and outside of institutions that these institutions are untrustworthy, and that we should only trust the people who care about us. And the people who care about us tend to be the people who think like us, look like us, pray like us. And so we arrange ourselves in these communities, discursive communities, sometimes in Facebook groups, sometimes on Reddit, sometimes in church, sometimes in the barbershop. that is where meaning is made. That is how we navigate what's important in the world. And that's not new, except for the Reddit and Facebook groups part, which is, only a few decades old. But this notion that we actually use our communities and our associations to sift through the madness of the outside world is actually how human beings have always done this. What we tried to do over the last couple of centuries is layer upon it a set of expressions from which these groups and individuals could pull information and perspective, and perhaps have the sort of deliberative moments that can drive forward the notion of self-governance and responsibility. And it's only partially successful, right? There's been, as Jeff has pointed out, right, there's never been a golden age of the Republic where citizens were able to deliberate equally honestly and with information and make decent decisions, with full knowledge. I mean, we elected Nixon twice, right? So like, this is not, there's no moment at which we've actually done this well. I would say actually in the late 20th century, the last half of the 20th century, there was a struggle to move beyond the standard voices of the powerful determining what was true and what was real in the world, and to diversify the story so that more people saw their stories presented and felt respected and heard. And we exploded that effort by actually proliferating the number of channels and voices in a radical fashion by the last decade of the 21st century and the last decade of the 20th century, first decade of the 21st. So we've undergone these really radical changes, but we still seek meaning and determine the truth in our communities, looking to people we trust rather than institutions.
If I can join in on that.
Please.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And first, to start off with this question of media literacy, Dana Boyd, who's a brilliant researcher, argues that we should be careful what we wish for with media literacy because we make especially young people skeptical of everything. And then that becomes an issue of authority. And I agree with Siva that we find meaning in our communities. And I think right now, more than ever, we must reread Hannah Arendt, especially The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she argues that, and I'll quote here from a post I just wrote this morning, the totalitarian government bases itself on loneliness, on the experience of not belonging to the world at all, which is among the most radical and desperate experiences of a man. And by this, she doesn't mean the loneliness epidemic the Surgeon General and media are blathering on about. It's not about incels getting dates. It's about it's about using fear to isolate people from their communities and to make them vulnerable to the siren call of authoritarianism and fascism and racism and cults and race hatred. That is what's happening in Springfield. So what gets me lately is that people think that Springfield is a matter of good or bad information. It doesn't matter what was spread. That is the vehicle, a vector for what is in fact, as Jamel Bowie has said brilliantly on TikTok, it is blood libel. It is pure blood libel.
And these are fundamentally emotional questions.
Exactly.
Right? So we can't fact check our way out of fascism.
Right.
That is the problem.
Right.
And thinking that the standard practices of vetting and certification and truth telling and fact checking are anywhere close to sufficient. I mean, they're necessary. They are far from sufficient.
So what I struggle with, Mona, is how do we imagine a journalism of belonging rather than just a journalism of information? How do we imagine trying to understand people where they are? That doesn't mean empathizing with fascists, but it does understand people in their circumstances, making them feel heard to that extent, having the ability to then have a discourse with them that yields somewhere. I struggle with figuring out how to do that, but it's not the journalism we have today.
And it does mean that there has to be an emphasis on generating conversations that are rich and respectful, because nothing works if we don't look at our neighbors and say, this person, this family shares a future with my family, right? That kid has to be safe in school, so my kid's safe in school. If we don't get that far in our just daily understanding of each other, then there is no point in trying to figure out what the proper rate of inflation is, or what the price of oil is doing and how that affects us, or basic questions about addressing climate change. Those are all technical conversations at a much higher level. If we don't have a sense of democratic belonging at the community level and the level of the nation, and ideally at the level of the species, then all of this is just noise.
What I worry about, among many other things, is that the propaganda, the incitement, the blood libel that people get online and through these sources can overwhelm the one-on-one relationships. So you have people who have no immigrants in their community, but who are fiercely anti-immigrant because of what they see online. And so it is, the community approach seems good, but it has its limitations when the information that people are getting is so poisonous.
But again, I think sometimes the objects of the hate are again vectors for something else. It is very suddenly now the idea of trans is going to destroy the morals of the youth. That wasn't in the conversation a year ago. It is now because it needs that vector, it needs that object, or it's Haitians in Springfield, or whomever it may be. So I don't know what we do about that. I live in a town that I'm surrounded by some Trumpists. I don't talk politics with them. I don't want to talk politics with them, nor they with me. And we don't have to. It's the coincidence of geography that puts me here. But what the internet has done is enabled me to belong to so many other communities that I wasn't part of before. And I treasure that. And I think there's some value in that. And it's been exploited by the likes of Facebook. Siva is brilliant on this topic and the problems there. And he and I might disagree just a little bit here about the virtue or peril of connecting the world. The idea that you could connect everybody, Siva has argued very well in his books, is problematic. But also the idea that we connected people means that people could find other people in communities that have a broader definition. And I have some hope there, but again, I'm not sure how to do that.
Right. But it's also important to remember that when you see something like what's happening in Springfield, Ohio, the outsiders flooding that town with terroristic threats, making people's lives miserable and in fact dangerous. The proper approach is not to say, but wait a minute, this isn't true, right? The rumors are not true. I mean, that's where the conversation has to start. The question should be, why are people so motivated to do this? And getting to the why takes real work. It takes deep work. It's far beyond just putting the most recent fact out there. And that is our challenge, right? So if we can understand why people are motivated to do things like that, and if we can insulate people from seeing that has some sort of reward in the world and response in the world, which I don't have an answer to that. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. We're still reeling from our invasion in 2017. And, there's the bruises are still clear. The wounds are still open. And this is a time of real danger and extremism. And again, responding merely with pleas for truth is not addressing the problem. The real deep question is soul deep.
Mona, let me ask you a question, if I might. I'm fascinated in the recent weeks about two Cheneys endorsing Kamala Harris and getting cheers at Democratic events, and 100 people from Republican administrations coming together. And on MSNBC, Nicole Wallace, I think, has been very eloquent about this, but the rest of media have pretty much ignored it. I see kind of a grand coalition forming here around protecting democracy. And it doesn't mean that we agree with each other, right and left. It doesn't mean that I'm going to cheer the Cheneys and forgive and forget things that I criticize them for. But it does mean that we stand together for something now and against something now. And I don't think that Kamala Harris had to buy that from anybody, from AOC and Bernie Sanders or from the Cheneys. I think that we saw the crisis in need. And in there, I would like to see some kernel of hope. You coming from a more conservative perspective than I think Siva and I do, how do you view that burgeoning coalition that we see forming?
So I would agree with every word that you said, except for one, grand. I don't think it's quite a grand coalition.
Fair.
I agree. It's
fairly
fleeting and
narrow.
trivial. Yeah.
Yes.
But there are some of us who have been transformed by recent events and have said this is not what we ever stood for, and it's not the American tradition, and we cannot tolerate it and have to speak out against it. And I like to think that even as some of us who formerly thought of ourselves as on the right, have been influenced by our new friends in the center and on center left and so on, that maybe there's a little bit of reciprocal action happening too, where I do get letters from people saying, I've been a left winger all my life and you've made me think again about X, Y, or Z issue. And so that's encouraging. It means that, when we can agree on the basics about, our democratic republic, we have the space to have polite disagreements about other things.
Absolutely. Liz Cheney came to my class last year. My class was actually called Democracy in Danger, and we produced a live podcast in the class and examined all of the various threats to democracy around the world. And she was so gracious to do this. It was one of her first public actions after leaving the House. And my students were bold enough to engage her on the differences they had with her and really pushed her on some crucial issues, especially on gun policy. This was just weeks after University of Virginia students had been slaughtered by yet another gun incident. So it was a really sensitive time. And she handled the moment with such deftness, humanity, and never had to yield on her own deeply held positions. And she modeled for my students a way to be engaged with people who see the world differently, but who fundamentally, again, share a future with you and share a country with you. And my students walked out wondering why there were so few moments like that in America. And of course, we model that in the classroom. We create an artificial environment where that is able to flourish in the classroom. And her presence was sort of a high profile moment of that. But that's really what we have to do. We have to build out and invest in the institutions that facilitate deep deliberation, so that people can recognize their humanity and recognize the sense of shared fate, so we can talk about words like justice and fairness sincerely without sneering. And I just think we are a long way from that, because we keep focusing on the surface issues and what just happened 48 hours ago.
We've gotten further away from that goal and also closer at the same time, so.
If I may, just one more question to you, Mona. I'm curious too. I'm fascinated, and fascinated is the wrong word. I hate what Rupert Murdoch has done to English-speaking democracy. I hate what Fox News has done to the country. I gave a grant to a former student of mine to start a site called Decoding Fox News. She watches Fox News, so we don't have to.
Poor thing.
And, it's brave work. It actually is brave work. But same to you is what I'm asking you is you in starting the Bulwark and working on the Bulwark broke away from what was seen as a half of the country. How hard has that been to stand up against the people you used to be with? My father wanted me to vote Republican his whole life, but I didn't. And so I've stood where I've stood for a long time, but I don't think you've necessarily changed, but the people you are with has changed. How do you weather that?
Well, it was obviously painful. It was very disillusioning. There were people that I believed were well motivated and were being honest about things, and I could trust their bona fides. And only to see them turn around and then justify the most grotesque things and realize, no, they could never have been trustworthy if they're doing this now. And so I am not I'm not the kind of person who says, well, I haven't changed, it's only they who have changed, because that wouldn't be completely honest either. Because I've made these alliances across the aisle, it's changed me too, and I'm more open to other points of view without simply dismissing them out of hand. I still think of myself as a conservative, and if you want to talk tariffs, I'm ready.
Well, where the hell does that stand?
I think we'll agree on tariffs.
Yeah, I think we will.
But there are other issues on which I have definitely changed my view. For example, on the abortion question, I always called myself pro-life, but I was never about lobbying to change the law. I helped to form a pro-life group that helped women in crisis pregnancies who wanted another option. And I'm very proud of that work. I still think it's essential work. There are so many women who find themselves with crisis pregnancies who actually do not want to get abortions and don't know where else to turn. And we provide help throughout the whole first year, et cetera. But I find that the pro-life people that I used to feel like I was in alliance with have become so punitive.
Yeah.
I mean, that was never what it was supposed to be about, punishing women or God forbid, having a woman bleed out, as Kamala Harris said in the debate, because they're afraid to treat her. I mean, this is just not anything that I recognize. And so on that, I have definitely moved.
Well, I think what we've done here, what Siva talked about with Liz Cheney, is that it's about taking these moments and modeling these behaviors and hoping we can manufacture more of this. I'm not sure how, but I think right here we've seen that, a discussion that brings that value.
Well, I hope so. All right. Well, thank you both for joining me in my debilitated state. And it was really good to talk with both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.